LEOFF board meeting, December 17th, 2014. Chairman Fox will be here shortly. He's tied up on another commitment or something, but he'll be in here in a little bit. I'd like to take a minute to remember those that have passed since we last met. Thank you. Approval of the November meeting minutes. I think the executive director has a change. I'm sorry. Was it June or July?
July. I'll talk about that after this.
Okay. Move in a second. Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Funding status project. Oh, go ahead.
For the July minutes, we discovered here earlier this week that the July minutes captured your adoption of rates for the next biennium, but at the time you adopted rates not only for the next biennium, but also for the 17-19 biennium, and those rates didn't get published in the minutes. We did communicate those rates to OSA and DRS and OFM in the rate notification letter, but we didn't get them into the minutes. So there's a handout in front of you that reminds you what those rates are, and it would take a motion to correct the July minutes to reflect the rates for the 17-19 biennium, which are equal to option 2B on your on the handout. That's 885 for the member, 531 for the employer, and 354 for the state. We did go back and confirm that by listening to the audio tapes of the motion and the vote.
So the motion would be for option number B then, is that correct?
To correct the minutes to reflect that option 2B was adopted for the 17-19 biennium.
Okay.
So move.
Have a motion? Second?
Second.
Discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Mr. Fox.
Good morning.
Brother, how you doing?
Good.
We're at number 2.
All right, Stephen, I'm here. You're taking a roll. Item number 2,
duly
educational
noted.
briefing.
Both at the strategic planning meeting and at the last meeting of the board, there was some discussion about the board's funding policy. And in reviewing the audit report, for instance, the outside actuaries audit report last month, there was some comments about the board possibly considering changes to the funding policy or additional things to consider as part of your funding policy. And you asked at the last meeting if it would be possible for OSA to talk about that a little bit further this month. And they were available. Lisa Wan is here from the actuary's office to address some of those topics. With that, I'll turn it over to Lisa.
There we go. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. I'm Lisa Wan with the State Actuary's Office, and I'm pleased to be here today to present information that I hope will be helpful for you in your discussions of funding policy for LEOFF Plan 2. As Steve mentioned, this topic came up last month and in response to the audit report from Milliman. To set up this discussion today, I thought it would be helpful first to start with some background information on your current funding policy and how that funding policy has developed the current financial position of the plan with some results from your actuarial evaluation, which is a reminder because you've seen that information already, and then talk about the audit report and the comments made by Milliman regarding your funding policy. I thought it would also be helpful to look at a projection of expected future contribution rates and funded status. Hopefully that will help you also in this discussion. And then we've brought some possible funding policy options for you to consider with some pros and cons of those. And just as a reminder, no board action is required today. This is a first discussion work session on this topic. So starting with the current board funding policy, the funding policy, just as a reminder, is how do we pay for the benefits that are promised from this plan? So what contribution rates are we going to adopt to pay for the benefits? That's what your funding policy is about. And the base funding policy for LEOFF Plan 2 is the aggregate actuarial cost method. So that aggregate method will determine the contribution requirements. Back in 2003, the legislature also adopted an asset smoothing method because the aggregate method doesn't have unfunded liability, so all gains and losses get rolled in immediately. So there's volatility in that funding method. The contribution rates coming out of it can be volatile. So in 2003, the legislature adopted an asset smoothing method, and then the LEOFF 2 board adopted additional rate stability measures starting in 2004. So the first measure, or the first adoption in 2004, was that the contribution rates would be no less than 90% of the normal cost under the entry-age normal funding method. And that would take effect July 1st, 2009. Then in 2008, a rate setting year, the board adopted the rates for 2009 at 100%. So really the 90% I don't think ever happened, ever occurred, although it was adopted as your policy and didn't have any end date. So it had a start date but no end date, which is why we refer to that as your long-term funding policy, because it didn't expire. So 2008 adopted 100% of the normal cost under entry age for 2009-13. Then in 2010, you adopted to maintain the current rates through 2011-17. And then as Steve just mentioned, I don't have this included, but this year in your latest rate setting, you adopted, again, the current rates for 15-17, and then 17-19 will be 100% of the entry age normal rates from this last valuation. So that's sort of a snapshot of the funding policy that's been in place for the contribution rates. Now, the funded status, which was the topic of the audit report comments, is calculated under the projected unit credit method at this point in time, because the aggregate method doesn't provide a useful funded status measure. Basically, the aggregate method says your funded status is 100%. So that doesn't help you see the progression of the health of the plan over years. So our office for the valuations has been using a different cost method for that measure, and we've used projected unit credit. GASB has now come out with their new accounting standards for financial reporting, not funding, financial reporting, and they're requiring the use of entry age normal. They used to allow many cost methods, including projected unit credit, but now they're saying entry age is the one all plans have to use for financial reporting. So based on that, we've decided our actuarial valuations in the future, so starting with the 2014 valuation, we will start reporting that funded status using entry age, just to provide some consistency with what's happening on the financial reporting side. And just as a reminder, oh, yes.
So on that change by GASB, at some point there's a rationale that they use to make that change. What did they express that, what that rationale was, so that we can I get a better understanding of?
I don't know the answer to that, but I will see if we do have information on that and provide it to the
Thank you.
board. And as some background, we did provide additional information on all of this funding policy, you know, what entry age really means in aggregate last year in a very in-depth presentation. So how has the board's funding policy translated to the financial status of the plan? This table shows the contribution rates under different measures. And as I mentioned, because that 90% doesn't have an end date to it, that's why we present that in the valuation. So we start first with the base method aggregate. So we calculate the contribution rates under the aggregate method. Then we apply that funding policy of no less than 90% of the entry age normal cost. So that number is also presented in the valuation as your required contributions. Then, because the board has had 100% as a policy, we also provide that number to you during your rate setting process. So those are the first three columns of numbers. And then the final column is what was recently adopted this year. And the resulting funded status at this last valuation is 115%. And just as a side note, under the entry age normal, which we will be moving to with the next valuation, that funded ratio would be 109. I don't know what the projections would look like under that method because we haven't done that work yet, but that's something we certainly can do if the board is interested in seeing projections under that funded status measure. So this past year was an actuarial audit year. So an outside firm, Milliman, was asked to audit the results of both the valuation and the demographic experience study. They found no material differences in their analysis from what we've produced. But they did have some comments on current funding policy, which was the basis for this presentation. And their comments I've summarized as they don't address a stable rate policy if the funded status continues to increase, and that the board may want to proactively consider an action plan in that regard. And they provided two suggestions in their written document and a third suggestion verbally, and those would be to de-risk retiree liabilities, adopt more conservative assumptions, or apply a funding ratio corridor, and I'll talk about all three of those during this presentation. So in order to understand where that comment may have come from, I thought it would be helpful to look at the projection of, and I've used the member contribution rates, and also a projection of the funded status. Now these projections, a couple of caveats, they're based on the last valuation. They do not include your 17-19 rate adoption. I wasn't aware of that at the time I prepared these. So when we add that in, it's not going to change the relationship of these graphs. So I just wanted you to know that it's not in there. And the other thing, too, is these are just expected. So it's assuming all assumptions happen as expected. We haven't gone into the stochastic projections, but we certainly can do those if the board has an interest in a particular policy change and would like to see, the risk of that. So you can see on this chart that under the top line is 100% of the entry age normal cost as your rate stability measure. Below that is the 90%, and then you can see the volatility in that base aggregate rate. Even with asset smoothing, you still have volatility in that aggregate rate. So adding the stability of that entry age normal cost limits that kind of movement in your contribution rates. And the next graph shows the expected future funded status. And you can see the bottom line is if the board moved just to aggregate. So just the aggregate funding method, no rate stability measure with entry age normal. The funded status starts to drop down and move towards 100%. The 90% entry age rate stability is also coming down because, right now you've been at 100%. So it is coming down a little bit, but you can see that curve is going to kind of looks like it's approaching 115 and probably will smooth out there. Whereas the 100% entry age is on an upward curve. And I believe that's where Milliman was coming from with their comments that, your current policy may lead to an increasing funded status, and you may want to consider having something in place to limit that increase. Because what we're showing here, just 12 years out, is going up over 120% funded status. So your current funding policy provides stability, but it also has a higher funded status attached to it. And as I mentioned, the member rates under entry age just increase gradually. There's a lot behind that. It's basically your new entrants are more expensive than your current members, so you've got sort of just a gradual increase as new entrants are replacing current members. Under the aggregate, a lot more volatility over the next 6 years. The decrease, yes.
I'm sorry if I'm interrupting your flow
No,
here.
that's
I
fine.
don't. How can the new members be more expensive than the current members? How does that rationale work?
It's just a matter of the demographics of the expected new entrants for your plan. So we look at what your new entrant profile has been, and we kind of develop this new entrant cohort groups coming into the plan, and they're a little bit older is what we're seeing of people coming in, so their entry age costs are a little bit higher.
Okay.
So that's just the reason otherwise you would expect your entry age normal cost rate to stay completely flat. Right.
Okay.
But you are seeing this little uptick, and that's the result.
Okay.
Okay. Under the aggregate, more volatility. So over the next 6 years, a decrease of about 120 basis points, followed by a 50 basis point increase each biennium after that, just for that period we looked at. So, 50 basis points over a 10-year period under entry age, much more volatility with just aggregate. And as I mentioned, the funded status increasing over 120% under the 100% entry age normal cost. That's a lot of numbers. So that's the background of your funding policy and where the plan sits today and what's expected in the future based on the assumptions we have. So as you're thinking about potential changes to your funding policy, some of the considerations would include the actual resulting rates and a balance of adequacy, stability, affordability. Where do you want to be in that area? Because you can have adequate rates, which is the aggregate funding method provides adequate rates, but then you don't have stability in those rates. So those are things to think about. What is your focus and your goal in that area? Another consideration is that if your funding policy is complex, that can lead to misunderstanding of your policy, which can lead to misuse of information, and then also to a complex policy can lead to complex administration of it as well. Some of the options for you to consider, obviously, is to continue with your current policy and regularly monitor that funded status. If that's the will of the board to stay with your current policy, we can also produce the expected funded status under the entry age normal funding method, so you can see what is expected under that method, which will be the new reporting method. Or the board could choose to adopt a new funding policy. and I'm going to share some options with you in that regard. If you want to consider new funding policy, you could consider changing the underlying actuarial cost method, which is right now aggregate plus rate stability. You could adopt new rate stability measures. So you may want to say that 90% isn't what we want as that long term. We want it to be 100% or something different. And then also you obviously would like to look at pros and cons of any options that are available. So the next two slides, I'm sharing some possible new funding policy options and some pros and cons, and neither of those lists are exhaustive. They're just some ideas we had in our office that we wanted to share with you. There could be any combination of these things considered by the board. We just wanted to share some ideas that we had here in our office. So first, changing the underlying cost method to entry age normal. Right now, you're already using the normal cost from that plan method. You could move to that as your funding method. So move away from aggregate and just move directly to entry age normal.
Would that require a statutory change?
No.
It wouldn't.
No, the adoption of the funding method is part of the board's authority.
I did read the statute too, and it does say aggregate or some other funding method. I think it just has to be a method that's based on a percent of salary. An entry age would do that. So you're already using the normal cost from that method. You would need to add the unfunded actuarial accrued liability, which is the other component of the entry age normal funding method. And that UAL can be positive or negative, which increases or decreases the normal cost or total contribution rate. But you can also put limits on that. And that unfunded liability requires an amortization policy. So if a UAL exists, how will we amortize that? Over 15 years, 20 years, expected lifetime of active members? Would need a policy for that. Another option is to change the rate stability measures when the funded status hits certain targets. So I think this was briefly discussed at the last meeting. I think this is also in relation to the verbal comments that Milliman made. And I've just provided an example here. So you may have your funding policy be 100% of the normal cost under entry age, as long as the funded status is below 120%, as an example. And then maybe if it hits that 120%, we move to 80 or 90% of the normal cost. So that's an option, very similar to what you have right now, just adding that funded status target measure. You could also just set a policy and adopt rates within that policy where, for example, you have a target contribution rate that isn't tied to a cost method, and that target changes if funded status hits a specific corridor. So, for example, you could have your total contribution rate, member, employer, state, at 18%, as long as the funded status is between 80 and 120%, so a 20% corridor. And then you'd have to have a policy when it hits that corridor. But that's just an example that you could have something as simple as that if rate stability is your potentially your number one goal. So again, those are just some options that we've come up with. There are many other options within those ideas or outside those that you could consider.
This is a work session, so don't feel shy about asking questions. I should have mentioned that at the beginning of Lisa's presentation. There is no board action today, but this is a perfect opportunity to kind of discuss some of these issues or pros and cons of some of these things or answer questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. More of a commentary or like a group query here right now, just for matter of discussion. The tools here make perfect sense that you've described. The application is well taken. To add to the conversation, how do we address perception on this issue as a matter of measurement? Will any changes we make be consistent with the measurement that the NASRA, National Association of State Retirement Administrators, would use, or Select Committee on Pension Policy would also use to measure us here to determine what our funding status would be, maybe even one-dimensionally, and people taking that as it's been a long time for us to actually learn to attempt to differentiate the value or the impacts, the utility of EAN, PUC, or aggregate method here, and understand their usefulness with what we're trying to do here as a structural issue. But as a matter of presentation, are we going to be consistent with the same measurement that the other groups out there use, that the public or that the rest of the legislature or that the Select Committee on Pension Policy would also be looking at here to say that you're overfunded, we can afford to defer funding, or are there other things out there that how is this compatible? How does this actually impact the potential perception of what we're doing here versus the reality of what we are trying to do structurally?
Well, that's an excellent question. And I think to some extent the answer depends on when you say the perspective, it's sort of who the viewer is. So for instance, NASRA, they tend to compare the funded status of plans around the country. And in that audience, having a good funded status, in fact, having our funded status, we're recognized as a model for best practices. If you flip the script, though, and instead of looking at it from the perspective of other pension plans who are struggling with funding challenges, and you look at it from the perspective, say, of a state budget writer, they might say, oh, those guys are doing a really good job. There might be a little, room to squeeze some money out of the left contributions. Yes. So that's, I'm just being frank. Yeah, and so, but the challenge there, and this is where I think some of the information that OSA is providing today and will be providing in the valuations is helpful, because one of the challenges has always been, even when I worked at OSA, we constantly would remind legislators and people looking at the valuation that it's just a snapshot in time. 115% funded is just a snapshot in time. Now, with the publication of the entry age normal history, which will begin in the next valuation, I think you can see some of the point that Kelly's been making. It's like, yeah, 115% looks good. Wasn't it like 139% though, just a few years ago? Yes. And so you can see that the funded status has been decreasing. Even for Left 2, it's still very healthy, but it's been decreasing. Now, though, we're at a point in time where at least where the projections, and that's where Lisa's information today, I think, is really helpful, that past decrease doesn't look like it's going to be continued. It doesn't look, if the projection was a continued slow decrease down to 100% funded, I think then that would be something that legislators would look at and say, there's no need to hurry that along potentially. However, if it looks instead, which the way the projections are, that no, 115, it might go a little bit lower, but then the projections are as some of these deferred gains this is the last year that the deferred losses from the market crash of 2008 and 9 are on the books. In Lisa's earlier slide, $225 million. Once that is recognized and off the books in the next biennium, now you're going to start to see the effect of some deferred gains on the books starting to buoy that funding percentage up. That, I think, is where there might be questions from outside parties, whether it's OFM or I always mention the legislature, but it could be OFM or it could be the members, it could be anybody saying, what are you guys doing about that? This kind of discussion today, I think, is a great first step. It shows that you're aware of the potential issues and you're discussing alternatives to that. You've got what my peers around the country would say a very nice problem to have. You're trying to figure out how you manage rate stability in a positive funding environment. That I don't, today's not an action day. I don't know what where you'll decide to go. Eventually, I would imagine that this will be a continued topic on into next biennium. I don't know if there'll be push this session in either the governor's budget or the final budget adopted by the legislature to mess with the rates adopted by LEOFF 2 or the funding method that you guys have used that's been so successful. That's speculation, but I think these are the types of issues that when that day comes, if that day comes, these are the types of questions that not only that other policymakers might be wrestling with or looking to you to see how you addressed some of these issues. The EANC will at least allow you to talk apples to apples in the future now when talking about other plans and history in LEOFF 2. As soon as that gets out there, I think to some extent that'll be helpful for the discussion. To answer your question about framing it.
At least I had one other kind of, I guess, commentary about our funding policy being consistent with our report, how we report. I mean, what's been confusing to me over all these years is that you fund under one method, you report on another, so you really have this, it's hard for us to explain that not only to our members. I mean, it's difficult for all of us here to comprehend these different funding methodologies when we report under different. So that kind of consistency, I guess, under the new, entry age normal will be helpful. I think where we find probably the biggest conflict is when we are working with the legislature on the cost of our plans. That we get back and forth. Well, you're adopting 100 because you're trying to overfund your plan. And I would admit we are trying to be conservative about our plan so that we don't end up in the troubles that everybody else has been in across the country. But at the same time, if you funded a 90%, eventually you're going to be underfunded by 10% if you were to adopt, based on, performance of the market and all those other factors. But so I think it's helpful for us if we are consistent in how we, our cost methods, our funding policy, and how we report those things. If we can make it as simple as possible you almost have to be an actuary just to be able to talk to a legislator about your pension plan, and it becomes very difficult, and it becomes kind of a, just a ping pong effect in trying to work on our plan.
Yeah, I think you've both raised some really good points about, that are relevant to this discussion. The complexity of your funding policy can make it very difficult to provide the information and support for the decisions that the board makes at rate adoption. I think also having a funding policy that's consistent with the other Washington plans is helpful. That's in my next slide with some of the pros and cons. The other Washington retirement plans use the same aggregate funding method as the base cost method, and they also have the normal cost under entry age as a rate stability measure. So they have that same structure. They just have a different percent of that entry age. So I believe State Patrol is 70% of the entry age normal cost, and all the other plans are 80. And Left 2 adopted initially 90, but has been adopting it at 100. So that's sort of the difference. But still the same base structure. Now, if the board did move away from aggregate and fully to entry age, that would create some difference in funding policy between the other Washington plans, and so a consideration for the board in your funding policy discussions. I also did want to comment, Chair Fox, on your comment about 90% would eventually get you underfunded. It may not if you keep that aggregate as your underlying, because eventually, aggregate could become higher, and then you wouldn't get down to that 90. So, but again, something we can consider in any of these options that are up here, or any variation on these options that the board is interested in. We could do more robust analysis, so stochastic analysis of projections, and that helps really understand the risk that the funded status could approach certain levels. So that is available, and I would expect that we could do some of this work next interim, and next interim is not a rate setting interim. So
I was looking at the slide number 6 is the one that kind of caught my attention, using our current methodology. I mean, none of us, I think, here really like to see that kind of trough there, because we know how difficult it is to come out of the trough.
Correct.
For policymakers, or more appropriately, decision makers, to try to bring it back up consistently over year after year. And then when you gave the numbers, about 50 basis points over a 10-year period, that's entirely doable, but it's a lot easier than it is to say we're going to decrease by 120 and then jump up by 50 basis points each biennium. Now we're talking about how, 1 year you have a bad year, and it's like can't do the 50 basis points this time. So then it's 100 the next time, and
well, and also back in 2010, when the board adopted that extended stable rate policy, it was from looking at these projections, and what those deferred losses from the Great Recession were, how they were impacting the rates. And the board decided we didn't want to take a drop followed by an increase, so let's just stay stable. So I think these are very helpful in those discussions, and really are part of the decisions the board has been making.
Mr. Chair, one more.
sure, Jeff.
Okay, I can have a follow-up on that. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just so I'm reading this correctly, on
Same slide?
Table 6.
Yep.
When you talk about the aggregate dipping, the aggregate, as a matter of simplistic perception, is really just a snapshot in time at any given point.
Correct.
And just in a generic assumption, so that I can preface what I'm about to ask here. If we talk about we are finally realizing the end of the losses from the dip in the equity loss, from 2008 to 10 kind of thing, 8 to 11. Does this trough, in consideration of the fact that the only income you have for the system has to do with either member contributions or return on investment? That's it for funding method out there. We are actually seeing that the member contribution rate under the aggregate would dip because of the better than average returns we've had since 2010. We're just finally into the point in the cycle where we're starting to realize that's what this dip indicates, correct?
I believe that is the result, yes.
Okay, so this really is a great example of exactly why we developed the smoothing method and the corridor method on this, because this is a matter of one of those great fluctuations we're seeing as the economy shifts here, that we should, as a policy-making matter, we should ignore this and try to contain ourselves within that smoothing corridor. This is just the normal fluctuations we're trying to avoid, correct?
I'm not 100% sure I got your question, but let me try to answer what I think I heard. So the aggregate method, there's already asset smoothing. So we have asset smoothing in those aggregate contribution rates. And you still see that kind of volatility, even with the asset smoothing method. So if we didn't have the asset smoothing method, those rates would be even more volatile than what you're seeing. But the aggregate method, it recognizes all gains and losses, but with assets smoothed, but still, it will recognize them all immediately. Whereas entry age, it doesn't, those gains and losses are in the UAAL component of that funding method. Does that make sense? So under entry age normal, you will see volatility because of that UAAL component. So entry age equals entry age normal cost plus unfunded actuarial accrued liability payments. That's the full funding method under entry age. So any volatility you're going to see with that method will come from the UAAL. The normal cost under entry age is very stable, but you will see some volatility because of that UAAL component.
Can you kind of walk through that entry age normal minus the UAAL, could be positive, could be negative, equals the contribution rate?
Exactly. Yes, so contribution rate payment under entry age normal funding method equals your entry age normal cost rate, which is what you're seeing up there, plus amortization of your unfunded actuarial accrued liability. Correct.
Oh, and now we're talking about the amortization policy. I heard you say earlier you could set it up for 10, 20,
Correct.
50 years.
And that would help stabilize that component of that whole funding method.
And when I think of amortization policies, I always think in the negative sense, right? You're making payments you're deferring payments into the future.
The UAAL will have every contribution rate setting period will have a plus or minus coming into it. It's this balancing item that sits there, and so you will. Some years it may be positive, some years it may be negative, but you'll amortize it over a certain period of time. Each of those components.
So our smoothing policy, I don't know, it's not a policy necessarily, but our smoothing method over the 8 years, anywhere from 0 to 8 years. So you'll take that into account. So like Steve's example, the $225 million in loss that we're still going to recognize this year would take our entry age normal, our UAL of $225 million negative, and okay, now we're going to set our rate based on that.
Well, the UAL includes all actuarial gains and losses. The investment gain or loss is one component.
Okay.
So there's also gains and losses when retirements are not as expected, when terminations are not as expected.
Okay, so all the other actuarial factors.
Exactly, all go into that UAL, and that gets amortized. So you've already amortized your investment gain loss right up front with your asset smoothing method.
That's $225, and you know that one.
Right, but then it gets amortized again in that UAL.
Okay.
Right, so whereas the aggregate method takes all of those gains and losses immediately. It's not amortized, and that's why you get more volatility in that rate.
In one of your earlier slides, you showed the liabilities of the plan, and the UAAL there currently for LEOFF 2 is about a positive billion. So even though on investment gains we're still recognizing $225 million in losses on the investment side from 2008, 2009, all told, you are at 115% funded, and that's where that UAAL of $1 billion is. So under the changing, if I understand you correctly, if you change to the entry age normal method, it wouldn't affect how the gains and losses are smoothed out. But what would change is recognizing the amortization of that $1 billion, that 15% surplus that's there currently over time, whatever time period you would pick. So because your plan right now is in a healthy funded status, for you, the amortizing the UAAL is actually dealing with reducing rates or recognizing payments, as opposed to for all the other plans in the past where that unfunded liability or amortizing the unfunded liability has usually been discussed. It's been with the old Plan 1s for PERS and TERS. They have all been in an underfunded status. And so any time historically here in Washington that term amortizing the UAAL has been used, it has been talking about
refinancing.
Yeah, from an underfunded perspective, as opposed to, in your case, a healthy funded perspective.
And that may be the reason that aggregate was, chosen, because it doesn't have a UAL, which has had a very negative perception, that piece. So under entry age, the full funding method of an entry age, what you would see right now, because of the health of the plan, you would see that top line come down because you'd be adding a negative component, because your unfunded would be negative. It's actually would be a surplus. So your total contribution rate would be something less than that 100% entry age normal cost line. Does that make sense? Okay. So I will move on to, I'm almost finished my remarks. Some possible pros and cons, and again, this is not an exhaustive list. We could very well have missed something that's important to the board as pros and cons, but we wanted to get some information out there to help you. Under the rate stability measure with a funded status target that I mentioned in the prior slide, one of the pros is that it's a gradual change. It's basically your current funding policy just putting some target funded status limits on it. So your aggregate would remain as your base funding method. It lines up with, as I mentioned, current practice, so it's not a dramatic policy change. On the negative side of it, it is more complicated because it's adding another layer to your funding policy, and you would have a little bit more variation in your rates when you hit those targets, just when you hit them. If you moved fully to the entry age normal cost method, it is a simple method. You wouldn't have any, rate floors or anything like that. It would just be entry age normal funding method. It is the most common method used by public plans out there, and it's, GASB approved. On the con side of it, it does have the UAAL that requires amortization policy, can impact intergenerational equity depending on that policy that you set for that component. And as mentioned earlier, it's not the base method used by the other Washington retirement plans, so that can cause some questions or misunderstanding. And the final policy option mentioned in the prior slide is a target rate with a funded status corridor. On the positive side, very stable rates. You know exactly what they're going to be as long as it doesn't hit that corridor. So, for example, in the example I gave, the member rate's always going to be 9% unless you hit that funded status corridor. On the negative side of it, it's not a clear actuarial methodology. So it's not based on an actuarial cost method. It's just our rates are 9% member unless we hit a corridor. And then you would need a policy when you do hit that corridor.
That's some of the problem with the old plan.
The
That makes
Yes, so for example, in the PERS 1 and TERS 1, the member rate was fixed at 6, so the employer had to pick up all, yes, sometimes lower than 6, sometimes more than 6, correct. So I'd like to just take a moment and go back to the audit comments. In the report, they listed the first two options, de-risking retiree liabilities or adopting more conservative assumptions, and then they spoke verbally about the funding ratio corridor. Regarding de-risking retiree liabilities, that's definitely a viable option to lower your funded status, but from our perspective, we would suggest looking at that as a separate study outside of your funding policy, really looking at what is our liability risk for our retirees and how do we want to manage it? Do we want to manage it any differently than we are right now? But looking at that as a separate study, not just to get your funded status down. The second idea, yes.
Again, I hate to, you're on a roll, but so when they say de-risk retiree liabilities, again, once they move over there to the retiree status, and somehow we take a portion of our assets and de-risk them and say, okay, that's set aside for retiree liabilities.
That is one thing you can do, yes. There are other options, such as purchasing annuities on the open market for them. I mean, there are various things that can be done in that regard. But from our perspective, we'd like to see it studied as one topic, and what are the risks of those retiree liabilities, and how does the board want to manage them? But yes, those are, you can isolate the assets attached to them and do like asset liability matching.
But if you were to do something like that, then we're talking about having $7 billion, $7.5 billion in market value. To set some of those aside, now we impact our bottom line with trying to reach our assumed return.
You could. I mean, right now, I don't know what portion of the retiree assets for LEOFF 2 would come out of the whole CTF. Because right now all the assets are in the CTF and all invested together. So whether that would have an impact, we'd have to study that. I'm not sure, but it's possible.
My experience of sitting on that, in the short time I've been there, it would have a tremendous impact over the ability to meet the bogey of the assumed rate of return. At least that's what we've been informed.
So their second comment was on adopting more conservative assumptions, and personally I read more conservative as not best estimate. So it would definitely reduce your funded status. It could also lead to higher required contributions and impact the goal of intergenerational equity. So if I can try and give you an example, if you moved your investment return assumption to 7%, your liabilities go up, your funded status comes down, which, would meet that goal of lowering your funded status, but then the contributions required to meet that would go up, and then you'd start adding more assets to your plan, and if what really happened was 7.5%, then you've contributed too high. So there's my comments on more conservative assumptions. So the final comment they provided was a verbal comment about applying a funding ratio corridor, and that is something we've shared as well that we think is a very viable policy option for the board. I think I'm at my closing comments. So just to share with you, your funding policy is very important to the success of your pension program. It allows you to balance affordability and risk. Your stable rates that you have been adopting lead to stable pension budgets, not only for employers in the state writing their budgets, but also for your members in their take-home pay. We've talked about complicated policies can be misunderstood, and we know where that can lead. And finally, the board may also want to consider the funding goals that are in statute for all the Washington plans, and those funding goals in statute are fully fund the plan as provided by law, establish long-term employer rates that remain a relatively predictable proportion of future state budgets. That is a mouthful. Again, stable rates, stable budgets, and the goal of intergenerational equity. So those are my prepared comments. I'd be happy to answer any more questions, and also just reiterate that our office would be happy to produce more robust analysis on any topics or options that the board is interested in or considering. And I would expect next fall we would be able to bring to you those projections, the projected funded status under the entry age normal funding method. We will have that work done next fall.
One thing that intrigues me about this, I don't know we would have any need to have further study, but intergenerational equity, how much does that play into your analysis and rate setting and assumptions from OSA's perspective?
Well, right now the aggregate funding method basically is your baseline. The goal under that method is 100% funded status over the expected future working lifetime of current members. So that's probably as close you can get to meeting that goal of intergenerational equity.
So as I think about it, the market really, the largest driver of that is our returns. So if you just happen to live during a downturn in the market or low performance over a number of years, you have paid more than somebody who happened to be working. And I mean, I look at intergenerational equity as like somebody that was not in Social Security and then gets out and says, I want to have my Social Security, or I want to get rid of the government pension offset because it's not fair. I mean, I look at things like somebody that's retired that wants something that we didn't have the time value of their money would be. So I'm just, so I don't see the whole. I mean, it seems like, I know if you purposely overpay, like if those of us that have been in this system for nearly 30 years, I don't know how we would argue that if the rates go down in the future because we've had great performance, that somehow we paid too much or that it's not been fair. So yeah. I just was kind of curious how that plays into the work of OSA.
Right. I think the aggregate method is really it captures it immediately. So it does the best job of capturing what has happened and then setting rates based on, again, the expected assumptions, but for the remaining lifetime of the current members, working lifetime of the current members. And then it comes down to making sure those assumptions are as close as possible to what we expect. But I don't know that any method could necessarily do a better job of capturing that. I suppose under entry age, you could, if your amortization policy includes the expected working lifetime of your current members, I think that would then also build that in.
Okay, thank you.
A
Mr.
tough
Chairman?
question, really.
Jeff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Councilor, you open the topic, and I'll be real brief on this, because we could, this one end up being a whole six-pack of beer conversation.
Yeah.
Lisa, can you provide us, just real simplistically, the intergenerational equity has always appeared to be a prospective definition going forward versus something that actually had a baseline, say, for example, at the beginning of our system in 1977, that we measure the cost and the relative benefits that have been provided going forward holistically throughout the whole system. That being said, can you provide us an actuarial definition of intergenerational equity that you used to determine this measurement or this potential outcome? And that would just be for future use of the board here and trying to determine exactly, to define something that's ethereal. Everybody sort of gets it, but we don't have a benchmark out there.
Would you like me to come back with a? All I can provide is what I've already said, that if you take the costs of the plan and spread them over the working lifetimes of the current members, that's the best you can get. Remember that pension plans are, I don't know if the word's normalized over all members. So, what might be amortized over the expected working lifetime of one member isn't the expected working lifetime of another. So, it's about the best you can get, I think, to meet that goal. It's really about not having what's happened in PERS and TERS 1 happen, because that is not meeting intergenerational equity. You are spreading those costs, although they're paid by the employers, but you're spreading those costs over not active members of that plan. And part of that comes from another component that can play into intergenerational equity is providing benefit improvements for past service. So whenever a benefit improvement goes into play and it's for members' entire service period, they haven't contributed for that past service. So that can impact intergenerational equity as well. Would you like me to get you more information?
No, thank you for what you've done here. I'm just trying to nail something down that would give us kind of a reference point. Somebody provides something that'd be a bright line definition. And the reason, what you've just spoken to, obviously is almost a prospective definition about potential benefits being increased in the future and having the people that contribute at that level. My point is if we actually have a baseline, say for example, the beginning of the system, we talked about the original benefits that we had at 58 and absolutely nothing else out there for retirement. None of the other values provided to disabled people killed in the line of duty, their spouses or families, the disability, long-term disability, all these things that everybody's contributed to, much less, say for example, the cost of $790 that everybody contributed to bring this board together. There truly is a baseline and an investment far beyond just something that you can pick at a moment in time now and say prospectively that we're going to move forward with this enhanced benefit. The people that are actually coming in the system now and receiving that enhanced benefit from all those years of effort and the money applied to the people from the baseline, the beginning of the system there, are recognizing that, receiving that for free, basically, because they're starting that. That is their baseline as they move forward here and receive additional benefits. So there's I think a larger, more holistic question as to determining exactly what intergenerational equity consists of, and also the inherent crisis problems that come with having multiple levels of benefits within a given system out there and attempting to administer those benefits. I mean, there's a lot of different issues that come into play, and I didn't mean to go into detail on this, Kelly, at all. But it's just that there's more to it than just something as simplistic. But I'm still looking for that bright line. Everybody always does. To, let's have a definition to start from so we can measure from that.
Any other questions for Lisa? Okay, thank you very much.
Next up on the agenda, the board had, as typical, votes on potential legislation for the upcoming session at your December meeting. This year there is one piece of potential legislation before you. It's a proposal that you have heard a number of times in the past and had a review of that earlier this interim, dealing with what's called the remarriage prohibition in L&I benefit statutes. So this item is a final proposal on that or a final presentation on that topic. With that, I'll turn it over to Ryan.
Thanks, Steve. Mr. Chair, members of the board. For the record, Ryan Frost, staff to the board. Steve mentioned this is a final proposal on the remarriage prohibition issue. So the issue is really that a policy inconsistency exists between the workers' comp benefits and retirement benefits for survivors of deceased law enforcement officers or firefighters. So a survivor who would remarry will continue to receive the retirement benefits, but they'll may lose their workers' comp benefits. And I say may and not will, and I'll explain that here in a couple slides. So, brief overview, remarriage is not prohibited in any state-administered retirement plan. Steve mentioned the issue was addressed in 7 and 8 outside of the board's research by a couple bills by Representative Kirby. And then in 2009 interim, the legislature requested info from LNI, and the bill was, or the issue was studied by the LEOFF 2 board. So after that study in the 2009 interim, we, or I should say you guys, proposed a Senate Bill 6407, which really hit on 3 main issues. The first being that remarriage prohibition being removed. The second was the lump sum benefit increase from $150,000 to $214,000. And the third issue was, where is that at? Oh, the waive of tuition fees for survivors, their spouses and children. So that bill passed, but it was amended to remove that remarriage prohibition. So only the last 2 ended up, the tuition waiver and the lump sum benefit were the only 2 that made it into the passed bill. So retirement benefit for survivors. If a survivor selects a monthly benefit and remarries, then there's no impact on their receipt of survivor benefits. It's true for all state plans, not just LEOFF. But as far as worker comp benefits go, as the slide I said a couple slides ago, that they may lose their benefits and not will. So they will lose their benefit if they if there's immediate work-related death and the surviving spouse remarries, or if there's a totally disabled member and then he dies and it was related to the claim, and the spouse remarries, they will lose their benefit. The only time they won't is if the member's totally disabled and then they die and it was not related to the claim, then they can still remarry and receive their workers' comp benefits. It's kind of interesting bill language in there. Not sure if it was completely intended or not, but that's just how it's written. So again, in the board study in 2009 found 4 states without remarriage prohibition, including 1, Nevada, which has specific exemption for police and firemen. And there are some admin issues as well. Removing the prohibition would be a lot easier for L&I statutes because they'd be in line with retirement benefits and it'd be easier to kind of keep track of those together. So your options before you today are 1, to take no further action, and option 2 would be to pursue legislation with the included bill language in the report. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Ryan? Okay, thanks, Ryan.
Yep.
Okay, are there any comments or Mark? Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Discussion. Okay. Seeing and hearing none. All those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. All right, that motion carries. Okay, Paul and Ryan, on item number 4. Unless we need to take a break for anybody else. I got here a little bit late, so. Okay, we'll take a break after you guys are done then.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, my name is Paul Neal, board staff.
Ryan Frost, staff.
We're here today to talk about plan design outcomes. The reason its title is outcomes is I think a lot of times presentations are put together about what's the difference between a defined benefit plan and a defined contribution plan. We'll be referring to as a DB and a DC. what we're trying to do is peel back the onion a little more here and look at what are some potential outcomes you could expect from those different plan design outcomes.
So with that, there's some recent funding problems in other state DB plans that's increased examination of DC plans for public employees. Three main examples you've seen in the news are one, Detroit, which was facing $3.5 billion liability in their pensions. They're having fewer and fewer workers and the same amount of retirees, which is compounding that liability. You have Illinois, which is facing anywhere, if you read the numbers, anywhere from $100 to $300 billion pension liability, and they're really challenging changing their plan to lower their rate of return assumptions, which would add even more liability to the plan. And the third option would be Kentucky, which actually earlier this year placed all their new hires into a cash balance plan prospectively after facing a $9.1 billion pension liability.
So we're responding to the board request for a briefing. What we're looking at in this presentation today is some current, and in some cases some very current research comparing the outcomes between DB and DC plans. And when we talk about research, I think it's important to take a moment to talk about a real pitfall in this area. As you're probably aware, there's a lot of interest around this DB versus DC thing. And whenever you're looking at any research, you have to be really careful to look at who's talking. There was an excellent article by Gary Findlay, who's head of the Missouri retirement system. It was called Public Pension Plan CSI, and basically kind of looking at what's the interest in the DC plans versus the DB. He came up with a good, an interesting phrase. We've all heard of think tanks. He came up with the phrase belief tanks, which is basically people or entities that have a pre-existing agenda and then present the information in order to support that agenda, much like an attorney would do in litigation. And that's happening from both sides of the debate. On one hand, you've got people represented by Grover Norquist and his famous quote that he'd like to see government be small enough that he could drown it in a bathtub. On the other hand, you've got Matt Taibbi, who's an example of that. He's a political columnist, did a big article on the public pension issues, but he kind of framed it in terms of the ongoing war on the middle class. So obviously these are people that are coming to the table with pre-existing agendas, and so whenever you're looking at research in this area, you've got to be really careful about who's doing the talking, because I can assure you that everything Ryan and I are about to tell you, if you wanted to find somebody on the internet that would tell you exactly the opposite, you could certainly find that. So we've tried to be really careful in the stuff we're presenting as to, looking at the source, so we'll spend a little bit of time talking about where we're getting this information from for exactly that reason.
So in weighing advantages of different plan designs, you got to be careful to consider the purpose of the plan. Is it one, to provide a retirement benefit to career employees, such as LEOFF members, or is it two, to provide a tax-deferred savings plan? And how you answer that question is really a big part of how you come down on the DB versus DC debate. So some differences in plan design. The purpose of a DB plan is to provide reliable retirement benefits to attract and retain career employees. You start with the formula of the 2% in LEOFF 2 times the years of service times your final average salary, and there's variable contribution rates to fund promised benefits with changes in assumptions or investment performance or aka your rate of return assumptions. In Plan 2, there's also a shared risk of underfunding. So in Plan 2, employers and employees split the cost 50-50. So if there was a underfunded problem, then the employers and employees would share that.
And the DC plan is most commonly, people think of it as a 401k type plan, where that may be authorized under different parts of the IRS code, but that's kind of a good shorthand. It has very predictable contributions. It's got a set rate. I think in a lot of cases you can't change the rate once you start it. That's certainly the case with our Plan 3s. Once you become employed and select a contribution rate, that's the contribution rate you have. The employees take the full risk of the investment performance, and also another issue that you can, unlike a DB plan, a DC plan, in some circumstances you can access it, albeit with a tax penalty, but a lot of people do pull money out, and that ends up not being such a good thing when it comes time to retirement. The DC plan does have a very low risk to employers. Basically, the employer pays their contribution, and they're kind of done with it. That's the purpose of this slide is just to kind of give you an outline of the basic plan design differences, which I think a lot of you are familiar with anyway. Thank you. This slide is sort of the elevator speech part of this presentation. A lot of the differences that we're going to be talking about as we get into this is a reflection of this basic difference between a DB and a DC plan. A DB plan has significant economies of scale and pooling risks and assets, which is basically what the insurance industry is all about, for a group of employees. And you get those advantages of that pooling of assets and risks and those economies of scale. They're very significant. That's a big driver of a lot of the cost advantages we're going to be talking about with the DB plan. Again, it's a very efficient structure for providing retirement benefits. It's a very efficient structure for career employees. There's this distinction. If you're a career employee, you're going to hang around to your whole career. DB is a great thing. If you're a more mobile employee, perhaps it's not, because this assumption about what makes a DB plan a good retirement vehicle is this assumption that you're going to actually do a full career within that system, or a large amount of a full career. The DC plan is a lot more flexible. So if you are an employee as an individual who contemplates that they're going to be changing jobs fairly frequently, then a DC plan, you may actually end up with more money to fund your retirement at the end of the day than you would with a DB plan. So that's kind of the dynamic, the two horns of the topic, if you will, that you're going to see reflected a lot in the upcoming slides.
So piggybacking off that a little bit is that the DC plan is more portable for a mobile workforce. So if you were to withdraw from LEOFF 2, you could pull out your own contributions plus interest, but you can't take the employer's contributions with you. As for a DC plan, if you're to move around a lot, you can take both the employee and the employer contributions plus your earnings, and so therefore it's a little easier for a mobile workforce to jump from job to job and still be able to take all their retirement income and invest with it.
And one thing you hear a lot in the DC versus DB debate is this ability of the DC to empower members to control their own investments. This chart that we've got up here, this is something that I pulled from a 2014 study by Towers Watson. It was a large study they did of private employees who are working full-time with a pension plan. And what this talks about is if you have a choice between, what would you prefer, an uncertain retirement with the freedom to make your own decisions, which is at the right-hand side of the spectrum, or a guaranteed retirement benefit, but the retirement plan makes the decisions, and that's what we have in a DB plan. There's a pretty significantly larger percentage that would prefer the guaranteed benefit without the investment ability, but it's not an insignificant amount of people who like the investment decision, and the biggest number, of course, is people that are neutral. So I think the biggest takeaway from this chart on that issue is that it's really not a hot-button issue for employees. Some people would like to have the empowerment. Some more people would rather not. Most people, at least when asked, were indifferent.
So a DC plan can also be less complex to administer. A DB plan requires tracking assumptions, your periodic experience studies, your yearly vals, adopting recommended assumption changes. And there's also the ramifications of plan design changes with a group that large. For example, the PERS 1 move from 1% to 2%, that was not backed by any raise in contributions or funding. So that really created a big hole in that plan.
And the DC also for the employers has stable contribution rates, and that point really was brought home to me when I was at the November SCPP meeting, and they had this table that the budget staff presented to the SCPP, which is how much more they're going to have to find in the general fund in 2015 and again in 2017 to fund the pension plans. I think primarily PERS. If you're having a DC plan and you're a budget writer, you never have to look at a slide like this because you just know what your contributions are and you make them. On the other hand, you never get the slides they were looking at in 2001 that said, contribution holiday. So you have that stable thing we've been talking about earlier. With a DC plan, you do have a very stable contribution rate. You know what your cost is and you make it. It goes up a little over time as salaries go up, but it's still a level percentage. This is the next few slides come from some research that was done, and it was actually originally done in 2008 and then just redone and reconfirmed and tweaked a little bit, actually just this month. It's from the National Institute of Retirement Studies, which we're a member of, and it's looking at DB plans versus DC plans. What's the outcome? What can we look at getting? And they really focused on, or they really determined that, in fact, the title of their report was "Bigger Bang for the Buck: Why DB Plans are a better method for funding a retirement system." They identified three main things that give the DB plans a funding advantage over DC plans. And again, going back to the earlier slide, this is really a function of this dichotomy between the pooling of risk and assets and distributions versus the individual. This chart talks about the pooling of longevity risk. And what longevity risk is just you don't know when you're going to die. So if you're in a DC plan, you as the individual have to kind of make your best guess and figure out how to how to arrange your payment stream, because people obviously have a strong preference to not outlive their savings. And so what happens is their savings tend to outlive them, which is a good outcome individually. But I was kind of surprised at the magnitude of this. What this chart is showing you, the yellow part of the bars is the amount of money that people leave to their estates or heirs when they die. And so what you're seeing is that under a DC plan, and the reason these numbers are so large on the left-hand side, these are total disbursements from a DB plan, or excuse me, a DC plan. What you're seeing is that 24% of the assets are not being used to pay retirement benefits. They're going to heirs afterwards. So that's part of that issue, because a lot of the money you're accumulating for your retirement benefit is not actually going to pay a retirement benefit. And that's, that doesn't happen in a DB plan. So what this is called is the over-saving risk, and that's one of the advantages a DB plan has of pooling that longevity risk. What a DB plan can do is they have to estimate, and I'm going to say this a little slowly. I know there's people in the actuary's office here. If I say this wrong, I want them to correct me. They look at the average lifespan. That's what they fund for. And so if a particular individual dies too soon or quote-unquote too late, that really doesn't affect the plan because of that, again, that aggregate effect of pooling. So you have that advantage, and that's one big source of the cost difference.
So another part of the DB plans providing higher returns is that there's more diversification. So in the commingled trust fund, which is the top 10 funds in the nation size-wise, you can see that there's a greater access to diversity of investments. For an individual investor, you won't see as much in private equity or as real estate because the purchasing power that they have is not as much as the State Investment Board has. The State Investment Board is also early leaders on the private equity market. They jumped out in front of that in '91, I believe, and so they really have a strong foothold in that area. And the graph on the bottom is actually shows the ongoing nature of a plan. That diversification doesn't need to change for a particular lifespan in a DB plan. In a DC plan, you can see that they're going to take on less risk and want to have more liquid assets as they get older. You can kind of see on the bottom there, as their age increases, their expected return goes down because they're taking less risk, which would make sense for an older individual to want to have more safeguards to their money.
And the third thing that Fournier and Ree identified is the fact that the reason you get higher returns is you have professionally managed funds and lower fees. Basically, we've got the State Investment Board taking care of that management and the fees. There's two sources of that difference. One is that that pooling, again, provides economies of scale that provide lower fees. With DC fees, you've got kind of a straight line. The more money you're investing, the more your fees go up. With DB, because it's all a consolidated fund, your fees go up and they tend to plateau because it doesn't really, cost a lot more. When Fournier and Ree were looking at this in terms of building their model that we'll get to in a slide or two about what the actual numbers are and the cost differences, they did a conservative estimate of 40 basis points or 0.4% of salary contribution, that the fees being that much higher, being 0.4% higher. The second piece was the professional management yields consistently higher returns, and that's just basically when you've got the State Investment Board doing your investing, you've got people who understand it, who are taking the long view, who are they make their living off of investing. Whereas in a DC plan, some people are good investors, some people are not. Probably most people are not. I'm not. So they also did a conservative assessment there of 0.6%. So just the difference you'd get in return is 1% net annual difference. And that doesn't sound like very much. With compounding, it accumulates quite a bit. And in fact, this is the largest single element of that cost difference between the DBs and the DCs.
So as Paul mentioned, here's that model, and it's the per employee amount required at age 62. And for the model, they had a 62-year-old teacher with 30 years of service who wanted a $2,700 a month retirement benefit with a 3% annual COLA. So for the DB plan, you can see that they require $504,000 at the end of their working career to get that $2,700 a month. For the ideal DC, which is similar to the TAP option in Plan 3, where the State Investment Board or a professionally managed investment would invest for you, it's about $700,000. And then for an individually directed DC, it's a little over $800,000 required to fund that $2,700 a month benefit.
Now, this might seem a little counterintuitive because I think people hear a lot about how DC plans are cheaper. It depends on what you're talking about there. What research shows is that when employers move from DB plans to DC plans, those are almost always accompanied by a reduction in benefits. So the savings, quote unquote, that you're seeing are coming from the reduction in benefits, not from the difference in plan design so much. If you wanted to reduce your benefits, your DB costs would also go down. That's not to say there aren't any problems with DB plans. The problem that we're seeing with the DB plans nationally is the failure to fully fund the plan as you're going along, which results in the unfunded liability. That's not so much a plan design problem as it is a funding problem. So putting that all together, this slide is a little busy, but I think it does a good job of sort of showing where the differences are. So I'm going to walk through this kind of slowly. So again, we've got the chart that Ryan just talked about, which is the 3 different cost levels. And it shows what's driving that. The left-hand x-axis, or excuse me, the y-axis, is the percentage of payroll required to fund this plan. And again, this is the ideal. The assumed plan is 30-year employee retired at age 62 with a $2,700 a month benefit and 3% COLA. So the DB plan, you have that cost, and they've got that at about 16.3% of salary to provide that. They go to the ideal DC, and again, this ideal DC is something like what Plan 3 members can do in this state, where they can have the State Investment Board just basically keep their money with the State Investment Board and get whatever return the State Investment Board gets. So they don't have the issue with the higher fees and the professional management. But they still have the issues of the lack of longevity pooling and not being able to balance the portfolio the way a large institutional investor can. And that kicks the percent of salary needed from 16 to 23%. And that's why these percentages in the box, these are like the percentage difference in cost savings. So it costs you 29% more to provide the same benefit with an ideal DC, which is you've got somebody who knows what they're doing, doing the investments and charging you a lower fee. The individually directed DC, which is the more common model, which is the third one, you've got those same 2 components, but you've also got the lack of professional management and the higher fees. And that kicks it up from 23 to 31%. That's a 48% difference in the cost to provide, again, exactly the same benefit. And one point Fournier and Ree made is that these costs, the cost differences for a DC are most likely understated. They used very conservative estimates, which I think makes sense because no doubt these numbers are going to be scrubbed by people that are in a different belief tank. And one example of that is the 1% total difference for professional management and higher fees. If you remember back last year, we were talking about fee differences between defined comp plans for the deferred comp, state deferred comp plan versus the privately managed. We found conservatively there like a 1% difference in fees just on that component. Then you've got the professional management issue, and so I think that there's a good chance that the cost difference would be bigger. Another assumption that Fournier and Ree made that's probably more conservative than what you'd find in the actual world is that they assumed that the DC participants did not withdraw any money before retirement. And if that person had done that, which a lot of DC people do, that would change these numbers quite a bit. So They also did, just really quickly, when they did their update of the study this year, they added an appendix where they did this same analysis, but with a firefighter retiring at 55 years of 25 years of service. I didn't use those numbers because their model also included a higher multiplier, so that would really kind of skew the thing. But the bottom line with that is they came up with the same kind of ratios of differences in the cost. It was a little bit closer. It was a 27% difference between DB and ideal, and 46 between DB and individually directed. But the same overall point is that you are providing the same benefit for a lot less money.
So this here is a 2013 survey of private employees done by Towers Watson. Towers Watson, as Paul might have mentioned, they're a global professional services corporation who consults on HR, risk, and financial management. This is the third year they've done this study. And what they do is they study full-time employees in a DB or DC plan. And so what this kind of shows is that in a traditional pension plan or hybrid pension plan with a DB component, in the factors of attraction, retention, and a long-term career, it's about the same. When you get to the DC plan, you can see that less respondents, less people responded to the attraction, retention, and a long-term career than in the other two. So what this really does is show an advantage of a DB plan or a plan with a DB component wishing to attract and retain a staff.
Yeah, and this slide is really about what's in it for the employer to have a DB plan versus a DC plan. I mean, is it just another form of compensation, or is there some benefit to the employer, from an HR perspective? And I think what this is showing is that there is a definite benefit. If what you want to do is attract and retain employees, which most employers do, I think that's particularly true in the public safety context where you have such a high level of training and ongoing certification that's required. You're investing a lot of money in your individuals to get them up to training and keep them trained. So that recruitment and retention incentive is important. As we talked about earlier, this Towers Watson study is with private employees. The effect is a little more pronounced with public employees, and that's because of mainly it's the difference in agility of salary levels for private versus public. Public salary levels are much more stable. What some research that I looked at showed that the overall difference between private and public salaries is about 10% lower for the public salaries. But when you add back in the value of the benefits, the health benefits and the retirement benefits, it becomes about even. So when you're looking at people, particularly people who are looking at a career job like law enforcement officers, firefighters, teachers, that recruitment and retention effect is even more pronounced for public employers.
So what this graph is showing you is the termination rates in comparison to PERS and LEOFF. Kind of the underlying point that LEOFF Plan 2 members tend to be career employees. So even from the first year of service, there's about a 2.5% higher termination rate for PERS than LEOFF. And you can see by about year 3, LEOFF members, if they're in the system for 3 years, they're sticking out. You can see the flat line. As far as the PERS members, you see a bit more of a gradual decline before leveling out at that 25 or 30-year range.
And that's consistent with just overall pension funding. I remember when I was working at the actuary's office a long time ago, I noticed that the employee contribution rate between PERS 2 and TERS 2, which at that time were literally cut and paste versions of each other, the employee contribution rate was a full 2 percentage points higher for the teachers than it was for the public employees. So I asked the deputy state actuary at that time, why does it cost so much more for the same benefit? And the answer was because teachers, like law enforcement officers and firefighters, tend to come in, try it for a couple years, either they decide it's not for them and they leave, or they stick with it for a full career. So you've got that a real difference in the characteristics of the population.
So continuing on the theme of a little bit of DB plans better serving public safety employees is the insurance needs due to your dangerous and physically demanding careers. It's difficult for persons in dangerous professions to obtain disability benefits. If they can, it's usually very expensive. And there's also the survivor benefits that a lot of that has actually come since the board was enacted, a lot of these survivor benefits. And there's also the absence of Social Security, which you all know by now that only 6% of firefighters are covered by Social Security, and 44% of cops are covered by Social Security. So having that guaranteed income from a DB plan at retirement is very important for public safety employees.
So in conclusion, when people are wrestling with this issue of DB versus DC, there's a threshold design question, and that is, what is the purpose of the plan? Is the purpose of the plan to provide retirement benefits to career employees and not much to people who are not career employees, or to provide a tax-deferred savings plan? And the way you answer that question, I think, determines in large part where you come down on this issue. In LEOFF Plan 2, which the board has the luxury of being able to focus on, as opposed to having to look at several different systems, employees are predominantly long-term career employees. Because of the nature of their job, they do need to have a higher level of disability and survivor protection than you see in the general population. And what the research shows is that defined benefit is definitely the most effective and efficient way to provide that benefit. The board's full funding policy avoids what have been the pitfalls of DB plans, because we all know there are a lot of DB plans that are in trouble, and again, they're in trouble for not fully funding the plan. By the board taking the steps it's taken over the last 10 years to make sure that the plan is fully funded, you've avoided those pitfalls, and so really that the downside of a DB plan you've avoided. So we were in pretty good shape, and that's kind of the summary of what the research shows us to date. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Jeff?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good presentation. Thanks for putting this together. I know I asked for this a ways back, and this answered a lot of questions. Brought up a couple more here, but first question was with Ryan with Detroit, Illinois, and Kentucky. The assumption was that there were issues of deferred funding on that, because say for example, with an annuity, the present value of an annuity is nothing more than a known mathematical progression out there. You fully fund it in the front end, pretty much the back end's going to take care of itself. Especially when you have economies of scale with a large state or city retirement system out there that allow not just a latitudinal but a longitudinal risk pooling out there. One of the thoughts that came up here was when you talked about other states out there that with the defined benefit system actually being a shared risk issue versus defined contribution, not a shared risk issue. And this is almost for Steve on this too. We have Bakken-House protection here that state that, for simplistically, that ultimately a trust fund isn't necessary, that an annuity or retirement between each individual member is an individual contract between that member and the state that's ultimately a general fund liability. I know that's being overly simplistic, but that's kind of the sentiment behind Bakken-House. When you look at that, is there any potential for other states not to have that guarantee to where defined benefit systems do truly stand on their own? And should that come to be an issue here, does the potential exist also that, for example, if rather than switching to a defined contribution system, that a defined benefit system could be statutorily crafted so that it was independent of Bakken-House protections and truly did stand on its own, which obviously would solve a couple of problems. It wouldn't allow the deferring of funding to a system like this because it would be a statutory mandated funding mechanism. It's not something that the legislature could play with along the way. But I mean that's the first stop for a question talking about shared risk. Can we create a defined benefit system if we're tending to go that direction and possibly make it independent enough so that doesn't require Bakken-House protection, but at the same time it does require full funding from the beginning.
There's a lot of really good questions in there for if you like to talk about pension policy. So I'll try not to answer your question, go at too much length to answer that question. But all around the constitutional protections that we have in Washington under the Bakken-House case, there are similar protections, whether actually in the Constitution or in case law, in the majority of other states. And that level of protection now has come under pressure, I think, because of some of the challenges that a lot of defined benefit plans around the country have faced or are facing. How does bankruptcy affect that? What types, what does the constitutional protection extend to all benefits or just some, like for instance, COLAs? In Washington, we just recently had the Supreme Court case dealing with that savings clause. Can you say this particular benefit, when it's granted, it's not protected? And the court said in the affirmative. That that discussion and debate is kind of going to continue. For instance, from just the policy thing, what would a plan look like if you had that savings clause? For instance, say you had Left Plan 2, but you had that savings clause on every single benefit in Left Plan 2. How different is that? The level of security, the reliance on I know what I'm going to get. It depends now on your own. Do you think decisions are going to be made based on financial reasons, which is where I think you were getting at in terms of that independence? If the plan is fully funded, then will it be left alone? But I think part of what the research shows, especially around the country, there were a lot of pension plan changes. For instance, there were a lot of pension plan changes that were made in Wisconsin, and that plan was, their plans were well funded. They were made there not for financial reasons, but more for, for other reasons, whatever those might, And so that, to the extent that you had a Left Plan 2 where that savings clause applied to all the benefits, I don't know what that would end up looking like in the future. You could, from a pure design standpoint, you could do that. And that is one of the challenges about DB plans is, I'll use this word, if you make a mistake in a benefit granting, whatever that is, then it becomes very difficult to fix that. It's just what where the challenge is getting people to agree on what is or is not a mistake, and even things that I think as time passes, you could have something that was 100% agreed on, 100% funded, and yet there's still pressure to change it from just changing attitudes in the public over things like, for instance, working after employment. That's a hot button issue right now as the population ages and more baby boomers retire, and everyone expects that working after retirement is going to become commonplace, almost mandatory, given the lower level of savings. Will that change public attitudes about working after retirement? I don't know. That kind of remains to be seen.
I didn't mean to take us into the weeds that far on this, and I understand. I'd like to continue the conversation afterwards. But all I'm doing is I'm anticipating something simplistic in that a defined contribution is market cycle dependent. 30-year career, you go to work in 1977, you retire in 2007, you're going to have better than average returns and a better payout on a bulk retirement system because it is simply latitudinal. You go to work in 1979, you retire 2009, you're literally going to have half the resources, half the assets. It's market cycle dependent. Specifically, there's no way around that. Defined contributions can have a bottom line that's zero at that point because you don't have longitudinal risk pooling that comes with a defined benefit system and all the members as they continue to accrue and go through the system. When that happens, you have this is a defined contribution systems, and my 10 seconds on a soapbox are nothing more than the biggest case of kick the can down the road that we've seen in the legislature here since I can remember, because ultimately you're going to end up having something that has no actuarial basis whatsoever as people revert to benefits out there or welfare-based benefits that totally have no actuarial funding when the defined contribution systems expire. So I'm trying to figure out if there's something out there that we can anticipate to address the issues. That's where this is going. We can continue at a later date. One more question. We have 3 levels of funding. with LEOFF 2 here. You have the 5 years you're in, you have that 15 years to where you can leave and take your contributions and interest, I think your employer's contributions and interest, and bail. Is it 10, Kelly? Okay, 10 years on, and then 20 obviously for vesting for taking kind of thing there, and an actuarial benefit versus bailing out in 53 for the is there, when you're talking about the advantage of a defined contribution system, if we took that 10-year vesting that really is everything but the state's contributions that you can take with you, that is the benefit of a defined contribution system and the portability aspect. If we could make that more flexible, we might address some of those issues out there that allow them to get out early. And quite frankly, if we still capture that 20% that the state's putting in and keep that with the system, whether somebody stays or leaves, neither one would appear to be damaging to the integrity of the system as a whole. So if that's something that we see through some of the research that Paul and Ryan put together, is it something we maybe want to look at as allowing maybe an ability to withdraw, allowing the total, or not waiting for 10 years. If somebody wants to leave after 5 years, they can do the same thing and have the benefit of a defined contribution without actually impacting the system in a negative way. Your thoughts?
Yeah, the provision in statute right now is if you have 10 years of service, you not only get to withdraw your contribution in interest, but half of your employer contributions and interest as well. So you could almost get to a pure DC type of thing just by upping that to 100% of the employer contributions and 100% of the state contributions. One of the little known things right now is just because of the advantage, the way the market is, the state's the interest that you get credited on that is 5.5% a year, which in a DC plan is actually right now looking really good. At the time that was adopted, maybe it wasn't considered such a great cash. But if you're investing in guaranteed or low risk right now, 5.5% is very difficult to get out on the open market. That, to the extent the policy goal, if you want to push it that way, is making it providing members who change employment to leave Washington with more benefits. Now, I don't know if that, from a HR standpoint, is the goal you want to go, or if it's the other way. Once you get them here in Washington, you want to kind of give them the golden handcuff a little bit and make sure that it's in their financial interest to stay here as opposed to and retire here, as opposed to maybe come here for 10 or 15 years and then go to Idaho or Oregon or someplace else.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jeff and I, just in going back to when the Plan 3s were enacted, the LEOFF organizations, the member organizations of LEOFF declined to put that in front of their members because it was a poor decision. You put it was like over 90% of them would not end up with as good a benefit. So I think a lot of the representative groups said, we don't want to put a poor decision out in front of our members. And I think that's probably part of my first thought about giving people an option, like 150% at 20 years or something. Well, they have that, but it's not in their best interest, and not to be socially engineering their retirement, but at some point, some of our folks do make poor decisions, and we didn't want to put those options in front of them. Any other questions for our staff? All right. Thank you both. And looking at our agenda here, Steve, your presentation on number 5 there, the review of benefit improvement studies.
Yes.
How long will that take?
It's scheduled for an hour. I don't think it's going to take that long, depending on questions.
Yeah, if it's set for an hour and you're the one who's making the presentation, I'm trying to gauge. I don't
Might
think
be good time for a break.
Then we got lunch right away, so I want to make
Oh, I
sure
see.
for the folks that are here not to. It's not ready yet, is it?
Well, I'll tell you what, how about if I get started on the presentation, and if we need to interrupt it for lunch, that'll be fine. It's a discussion type thing rather than action item. I think that'll be, that would work
Might
out
be a
fine.
welcome break halfway through, I would guess, so. All right, we'll get started with item number 5.
Okay. By way of background, at the strategic planning meeting, there was a bit of discussion at that time how member desires, the general plan membership for benefit improvements seems to be increasing, and there's more questions being asked about when are we going to get a bigger benefit, get a big benefit improvement that may be a result of the number of members who are eligible to retire right now or approaching, going to be eligible to retire in the next 3 years. That may be why some of the interest. At the time the board was first created, again, there was a lot of interest in benefit improvements, and there hadn't been a lot of work done by the legislature on some of these ideas. And so the board literally reviewed well over 30 different types of benefit improvements or variations on benefit improvements. I'm not going to go into all of those. There's a handout in your materials that kind of summarizes all of those ideas that were studied by the board, priced by OSA. It was an extensive amount of work over several years. But most of that work was done in 2004, 2005. So members who are around today, even if they were also members at that time, they may not remember it. This is just the purpose of the presentation today is to sort of give you, briefly familiarize you with that study that was done. And I'm going to zero in on 5 examples in particular. So with that, one of the most frequently discussed benefit improvements is changing the multiplier, the current multiplier of 2%. And there's a lot of different ways where the multiplier could be changed, whether it's just a flat increase, change it from 2 to 3. The board also studied it looking at tiers based on years of service, making it prospective, making it retroactive, and or coming up with a combination where instead of there being where the goal, for instance, might be to somehow get to 60% of your benefit at 25 years of service. All of those options were looked at in the past. The one I'm going to briefly go through right now is just a flat change to the multiplier of 2.5 from 2 to 2.5. The total rate impact of that is about 8.8%, or it was when that issue was last looked at, which was, I believe, back in 2004. This was one of the earlier ones. In the biennial cost of that, or the long-term cost, I should say, of that, was about $4 billion total. That would be $2 billion for the members and $2 billion for the state and the employers. The biennial cost, this was more kind of the state impact, like what you would see on a fiscal note, would have been $222 million. The other idea that was looked at to sort of moderate some of that cost is, what if you did it prospective only? So leave the 2% that you've already earned and paid for all your service, but just moving forward, change the multiplier to 2.5. That reduces the cost. The total 25-year cost decreased then from about $4 billion to about $3.1 billion. And when I looked at these numbers, I had questions. It's like I can't adequately explain why the decrease prospective only reduced the cost by the 900 million. In my mind, I would think it would be more than that, but part of that is, I realize too, it's been a long time since the board looked at some of these, and so the familiarity with how these numbers were developed and what goes into all of those cost numbers, I don't have it today like we might have had back in 2005. I apologize for that. But this is just to give you an idea of some of the scale of some of these benefit improvements. One thing about, from a policy side, one of the features about a multiplier change that was considered beneficial from the when the board discussions is multiplier is one of those benefit improvements that applies equally to all members. And I'll talk about that a little bit in comparison to some of the other benefit improvements that were studied by the board. For instance, another area that was studied by the board, final average salary. Currently, it's the highest 5 years or the highest 60 consecutive months. And in LEF 2, that was 2 years. In all the old plan ones, it was 2 years. 3 years is not a common period in other plans around the country. If you changed it from 60 months to the highest 24 consecutive months, and you applied it to all members right now, all service right now, you would see the total 25-year cost of $3.2 billion, with a biennial cost to the state of roughly $170 million. Policy-wise, this also raised a couple of different types of questions. One, it does tend to, it favors members who have higher salary increases in their final 2 years, as opposed to members whose salary is flat in their AFC period. The other thing is, one of the reasons why the state moved to a 5-year AFC period from 2 years was concerns over salary spiking. And so, for instance, in LEF, overtime was not included for LEF 1, who had the 2-year period. Overtime was included for LEF 2, because there was a belief that the 5-year AFC period helped moderate the potential spiking possibilities of overtime that might be created with just a 2-year AFC. Retirement age. Retirement age is not just in Washington and not just in LEF, but this is the benefit improvement that is by far the most popular among members. If you survey members, whether it's in PERS or teachers, whether it's in Washington or Florida, about what benefit improvement would you like to see, earlier retirement age is almost always at the top of the list. But one of the things that if you dig into it a little bit, and many of you know this from your own personal experience now in LEF 2, or the experience of members, the retirement age in LEF 2 has gone from 58 to 55 to 53 with some of the earlier, you can go out earlier with reductions. But the actual age at which members are retiring has been gradually increasing. And it certainly hasn't been decreasing. So even though the retirement age has gone down to 53, the average age of retirement is over 57, and it hasn't decreased accordingly. What that means is there are people who receive the benefit of an age 53 are the ones who do go out at 53, but everybody is paying for that. And so if you work past age 53, you're paying higher contributions for other people to be able to retire at 53. The board looked at what if one of the options that was looked at for changing the retirement age was, what if you just got rid of that 3% per year reduction that's out there from 53 to 50 if you have 20 years of service? The total 25-year cost of that is $345 million. So you know, if you had that subsidized early retirement out there and you just made it completely unreduced early retirement all the way down to 50, that was the expected cost of that benefit. Survivor benefits. As you know, you don't have a free survivor benefit in LEF 2. LEF 1, the spousal survivor benefit is built in. But in LEF 2, if you want to provide a survivor benefit, you pay for it in form of a reduction to your pension. The amount of the reduction is based on the difference in age between you and your spouse. The board looked at a number of different options again for this, but the one here that is, what if you just gave them the full 100 joint and 100% survivor benefit, no without the reduction, if that was a free benefit. Total 25-year cost of that benefit was $2.7 billion. So that was one, I think, where maybe there was more cost than what was expected. This was also a lot of the members who are married at the time of retirement obviously would then benefit from this type of benefit improvement, whereas members who are not married would not receive any benefit from this, but they would still pay the contributions. Another very popular topic was retiree health care. LEF Plan 2, the pension plan itself, does not provide any retiree health care benefits. So medical coverage after retirement is either some employers have that built into their plans, but for the most part, it's a member responsibility. I think the number of employer healthcare plans out there that provide retirees, allow the retirees to continue in the plan, has decreased since the last time that the board has looked at that, according to the studies that we've been doing. And I know for instance, some of the AWC plans that are out there have removed that. The Seattle firefighters had a provision where retirees from outside of Seattle could buy into they've eliminated that provision as well. So there has been a decrease in the availability of retiree access to health care. The PEB plan, the plan that's available to state employees, allows retired state employees to continue in the plan. And there was a proposal that was supported by the board several years ago to allow LEF retirees to be included in that that same pool as active state employees and state retirees and retired teachers were in that pool. The long-term cost of that is not on the slide, but the biennial costs you can see are there. There was a lot of questions about the fiscal note on that one. There were a couple of different pieces to the cost. The direct subsidy and what was called the implicit subsidy. The state specifically pays a piece of the insurance costs for every member of that pool. That's what's called the explicit subsidy. That's something that changes with every state budget. It's been decreasing as the state's been facing budget challenges. But the other part is what's called the implicit subsidy. Because the proposal would have allowed left two retirees into the pool. Again, left two members are retiring at an average age of 57. So they would be entering the pool at an age where their expected medical costs are higher than the current expected medical costs for all the other people in the pool. As I mentioned, the pool currently includes all state employees, active state employees. That implicit subsidy impact was something that was estimated by the Healthcare Authority in their fiscal note. And that was, again, this was another $1 billion price tag. Oh.
Thank you. And actually, Kelly, you might be able to answer this question better. Do police officers have a version of MERP? Are they invested in our version of MERP? And then the second question is, does MERP only cover from retirement to Medicare eligibility, or does it cover for the rest of your life?
The rest of your life. Okay. Representative Vandeweghe is asking about a retiree medical trust, totally separate from what we have here on any kind of state-run plan. And I know that WACOPS had considered it, and I think some individual affiliates there started their own VIBA, but not the medical expense reimbursement plan that is unique to the Washington State Council of Firefighters.
Yeah, if lunch is ready and if you guys want to go get lunch, think about what kind of questions, and then you could ask questions while you're having lunch. That'd be fine with me.
Okay. Well, we will be recessed. Let's take about 15 minutes, use the restrooms, and we'll reconvene around noon. Okay, we'll go ahead and call the meeting back to order. So if you have questions for Steve, that's where we are, right, at the question component?
Yeah. And also, just general kind of high level, the purpose of the presentation is just sort of to familiarize you with the work that was done in the past, and then also to get a feel from you if there are any topics in particular that you would like to get updated cost information on. Obviously, we're not going to ask the state actuary's office to reprice, all 37 proposals that they priced before. But if there were a couple in particular that you were interested in getting updated numbers on, then we could let them know ahead of time and they could begin to include that in their workload. They're getting ready to start session, but there is the possibility that they could put some of these into the queue with the idea then that they could report back with, next interim.
Steve, so in direct response to that, I think the philosophy here for at least the fire members here were whatever benefit we look at is something that we try to capture, something that benefits all our members. And so I would ask that that we suggest here, at the mercy of the board, that we look at FAS and multiplier as the two things we'd like to see an update to. Okay, Kevin?
Thank you. Is there any statistics on how many members do not retire at age 53? For the folks I'm familiar with, that seems to be a pretty common thing. And I think the main factor is that they just enter the career late. But I was wondering how many, if we know how many members don't retire at 53, and then something that we've talked about before is actually how much would it save the system that we could maybe invest in a different benefit if the retirement age was actually potentially even looked at raising it by a couple of years.
I'll take a quick whack at both of those questions. I don't remember the specific number, but it is in the demographic experience study, the idea of how many people actually retire at 53. And for some reason, I don't remember that exact question being asked in the most recent experience study that was just concluded. But at the one 6 years ago, that I know that question came up, and at that time, only about 16% of left two members were retiring at 53. And I think the I think the assumption was changed upward. There was a belief that part of that might have been due to the economy at that time. I think the assumption was maybe changed to like 25% now, but I'll get that. That's a rough idea of the range, though, and I can get you the specific number if you want. The second piece of that, back when there was different groups, the State Council of Firefighters, for instance, their executive board, I remember one time they had a very detailed discussion, a very in-depth discussion about how would you pay for a potential future benefit improvement, like, for instance, change to the multiplier. And the idea of maybe part of that cost could be offset by changing the retirement age was floated then. None of the organizations have taken a position on that. I think there was a belief that the fiscal note, for instance, when the retirement age was lowered from 55 to 53, there was a very significant fiscal note on that change, lowering it down. And so the idea, I think, was, well, if it's going to cost $1 billion to improve the multiplier, and it was $1 billion fiscal note on the early retirement, maybe we could swap them. Now, knowing what we know now, we'd probably rather have the multiplier than the early retirement, so maybe we could swap the two. And part of it is that when we looked into the details of that, by we, I mean staff, talked to the actuary's office, what would the savings now be? Would we save $1 billion if we just changed the retirement age back to 55? And we wouldn't. Part of it was when the retirement age was lowered in 2000, there were these assumptions that a very high percentage of left two members were going to retire at 53. Those assumptions may have been based on the economy. As of the year 2000, things were more booming. But then shortly after that, there was the tech crash, and then there was the recession. So those assumptions about how many people would retire have been gradually changed. And so as every valuation that's gone in, that's come about, both prior to the board being formed and since, there's, with the experience studies, there's some of the potential savings, if you will, have already been recognized. So you wouldn't save $1 billion anymore. That would be something, though, that you could look at as the board. We could still ask OSA to reprice that, if you will. What would the savings look like if you went back to an age 55 retirement? Or I think the specific example we asked them was 55, but leave that 3% a year reduction to age 50 for the people with 20 years, so that there wouldn't be a feeling that anybody lost anything. that might have been counting on that 50 and 20 option.
And there might be some Bachenhouse considerations that you'd have to look at. Steve talked about swapping out two things which might meet Bachenhouse, but you couldn't take something away without giving something of equal value.
I'll speak to some of the dialogue we had at the Washington State Council when we talked about these issues. Number one, our first thought process was that it cost $1 billion, it'll save $1 billion if you got rid of it. And, we had to recognize that was not accurate. But then we looked at that and said, as part of a discussion about plan improvement, benefit improvement, that we would look at, in combination with that, maybe this component of going from 53 to 55, because your members are not utilizing that earlier retirement age anyway. So it was all part of, if you talked about a multiplier at the same time, just one other component of, offsetting the cost would be perhaps raising the retirement age slightly, and then, as Steve indicated, but then keeping the early retirement factor consistent at the 3% back to age 50. So that's how we kind of looked at it after we had Steve had met with our board and had educated us appropriately. Jack?
Steve, I'll also like to see the survivor benefit reduction, to price that out. And when you're talking about the cost, you keep saying the state, are you talking, is that split between?
That's another thing that I realized going back over the materials is, particularly in talking to some of the stakeholder groups, I don't think I was always consistent when I talked about the cost. So, for instance, today I wanted to make sure that we were talking about the total cost. I think at different times I've talked about what is the total cost, what is the employer cost. Slide right there has what's the fiscal note cost, which is essentially a state fiscal note. And I think as time has gone by, some people have only remembered the lower numbers. And so they're like, oh, I remember that one. That one was only going to cost $9.9 million, as opposed to the full cost over 25 years, or the full cost to both the members and the state. And there were different parameters that the board was working on under then. As you might recall, there was a kind of a perception at that time that members kind of had that maybe a 10% contribution to Left 2 was sort of considered a cap on what members would be willing to pay, that they'd be okay with rate increases up to a point, but if rates got above 10%, that would that might be a concern to the members in terms of their own personal budgets. So I will try to make sure that as we talk about these in the interim and in the future, that I talk about the total costs, and that I'm consistent in the way that I explain that cost, no matter who I'm talking to, and I think will help avoid any confusion over what some of these benefit improvements cost.
Okay, in the, going back to, I guess, using the multiplier, just an example, you're talking 4.49% is what you have listed here. That would be split. 50% of that would go to the employee.
Yes.
And then the other 50% would be divided 60-40 with the state and the employer.
Yes.
Okay. Is there a pitfall if if the members decided they would pick up that entire amount of 4.49, or if the city would pick up their part and leave the state out?
Now, that has been a policy issue that's been discussed. Not only it's come up in a number of different ways with respect to benefit improvements and in other areas as well. where members in general have said, well, I'd be willing to pay more to get an improved benefit out of LEF 2. One of those things, that's where I think how much more is where maybe some of that talk about a 10% limit came about. The other piece had to do with some members were more willing to pay increased contribution rates as long as the benefit improvement was retroactive, that it would apply to all their service. And so the idea of a guy who's about 1 year from retirement and he knows he's only going to pay that higher contribution rate for 1 year is more willing to pay more if he, for that benefit than maybe the guy who's just starting his career and he doesn't know what to do. That cost shift idea, for instance, came about. The other issue, though, is on the flip side. There have been a number of legislators, for instance, and some members who've proposed what would LEF 2 look like if the state got out of the funding business altogether. From the state side, it's usually coming from the budget angle. How much would the state save if we were no longer paying into LEF? The state pays about $120 million per biennium right now into LEF Plan 2. And there are pros and cons of that. There's obviously a financial advantage to not doing it, but public safety is one of the primary responsibilities of government. And also there's a concern, I think, that some legislators felt like the older pension plans, LEF 1, for instance, didn't have any state participation, and they felt like design issues over what types of benefits were granted might have been different if the state was kind of a moderating influence in those discussions. Virtually all LEF 2 members are local government employees, and so the state's role in essentially local government employees and employers deciding on what level of pension benefits is appropriate, that has been a question that's come up a lot of times. As long as they're paying 20% of the contributions, then there's a clear reason for state involvement in those discussions. On the member side, I think also, depending on the economy and where you're working at, over time there's been a belief that if the state wasn't involved in approving pension legislation, for instance, if it was just up to members and employers to decide the level of benefits, that the benefit level would be higher, that the benefits might, we saw the results of the study that was done by the Washington State Institute for Public Policy, where LEF 2 benefits ranked, I want to say, 32 out of 40-some peer plans that were looked at, that I think there are some members who felt like that would be, the LEF 2 would be more towards the middle of that range if it was totally up to the employers. The employers understand it better, or the members understand it better, and they would be eliminating the requirement that any benefit improvements be state legislation, for instance, would allow that adequacy issue to be addressed quicker. How all of that plays out, I don't know. The bottom line is, if the state wasn't paying $120 million per biennium, somebody else would have to, whether it's members or employers. And the employers have been clear that they're not looking to pick up any additional, they don't see any benefit from picking up any additional LEF 2 costs right now, even if maybe the state does or the members do. That 50-30-20 cost split is also, to some extent, a Bachenhaus issue. it hasn't been tested in courts, but that's generally been considered one of the benefits of the plan. Now, employers, they don't have Bacchanhouse rights. So if the state said the cost split is now going to be 50-50, that might be more challenging for members to show how they are disadvantaged by that particular change. And there are certain groups, even within Left 2, as new employers have been added, for instance, over time, where the state doesn't pay any of the costs. So, for instance, higher education institutions were added. The costs for some of those higher ed firefighters, I think, might be split 50-50. There's a few little oddball exceptions to the 50-30-20 rule that already exist in statute. Yep, got a note on that. Yes.
Any other questions for Steve? Because he's got answers. Okay.
Okay, next up on the agenda is the always eagerly anticipated administrative update. The couple of quick points that I want to make on this one. First off, Select Committee on Pension Policy. They had their final meeting of the year yesterday. At that meeting, they voted to move forward with legislation providing Washington State Patrol members with the same type of purchase of annuity that the legislature approved for Left 2 last year. You may recall at the last meeting I mentioned I had some concerns about the way the potential costs of that annuity were portrayed, but the follow-up presentation in December, I think, did a much better job of explaining what the potential, they didn't call them exactly costs, but the way the potential risks are and the methods that are in place to already mitigate those risks. So, for instance, the idea that there could be a cost to the annuity because of experience differing from the assumptions is mitigated by the fact that the assumptions are all periodically reviewed. So I did not testify on the annuity issue at the SCPP yesterday. One thing that was also interesting at the that I thought was interesting either at the meeting, though, is they did an interim review. That was part of their December agenda, where they reminded all the committee members of sort of all the issues that had been worked on during the interim. That's something that the Left 2 board has never done, but I'll talk with you about that next interim, about whether that is something that you'd like on the December agenda. Outreach activities. There was, since the last meeting, there's been a couple of events. I attended a Washington State Council of Firefighter Executive Board meeting. Asked that's become fairly common now that they'll ask me to be available for a half hour or so to answer questions about either what the board is going on or maybe about issues that are going on in their locals with respect to Left 2 benefits. And Tim was at the 2014 Washington State Association of Counties conference in Spokane. We've done a outreach to a number of different organizations where the board has not, or the staff has not presented at in the past, where even if we're not presenting, that we've got a table there with staff available to answer questions that those different organizations might have with respect to LEF 2. From the employer side, the fire commissioners have always invited us to do that, but they've been the only organization up until this last year. Now we've got a schedule developed already for 2015, which is in your materials, of a number of different organizations where we won't be presenting, but we'll have a table there with staff there to answer questions that members or the organizations may have about with respect to LEF 2. A couple of upcoming events. WACOPS has their winter membership meeting in January, and the Washington State Council of Firefighters has both their legislative conference and their educational conference coming up in February and April, early in what will still be, for certain, legislative session. So that's all I had for the outreach activities. One thing I wanted to mention with respect, we'll talk about this more in agenda items for future meetings, but we'll build on what we did last year for the meetings during session. Last year we did some electronic meetings. There wasn't a quorum, no action was taken, but it was a chance for a legislative update and an administrative update if appropriate, and also a chance to do Q&A with board members. We'll do that at the very least for the January meeting. We've got some new technology that we hope will make it more, make these electronic meetings more accessible. They'll be easier for staff to use. We'll be able to have the meetings, for instance, here in the boardroom, so there'll be plenty of room for the public. Once we have a chance to sort of test out these new or these changes in January, that might allow for a little bit more to be done with these electronic meetings during session than just the updates that we had done. We'll talk with you about, for instance, maybe some of these pricing issues, providing the feedback on that. The one other item, or a couple of other items with respect to the admin update. Earlier on in the interim, one of the items that we brought to that the board asked to bring to the SCPP was the idea that came up, as you'll recall, during this interim. It was very challenging for the board to adopt all of the assumptions in the economic or the demographic experience study and adopt rates at the same time. You sort of had two moving pieces going at the same time, and they affected each other. If you had adopted some of the assumptions or not, that would have affected rates quite a bit, and it's hard then to adopt rates without knowing ahead of time how the assumptions impact those rates. In this case, by adopting all of the assumptions that the actuary had recommended, that worked out, but it identified sort of a process issue that where the timing of these two reports being due at the same time. It was very challenging for the SCPP, for instance, to make recommendations to the Pension Funding Council about rate adoption, and they had more time than you guys did. So I mentioned to the select committee the idea of changing the timing of the demographic experience study so that the results of that would come due on a non-rate setting year. OSA looked into whether or not statute would even be required for something like that, and has determined that no statute would be required. So the current plan is that the next experience study will actually be done in 5 years. So it'll land on a non-rate setting year, and then it'll go back to every 6 years after that. So it'll continue to be on a non-rate setting year. For those board members who are still on the board 5 years from now, you'll be grateful then. But the other issue that I wanted, by way of reminder, has to do with bill writing. So, for instance, I had been contacted by a legislator who said specifically that if the board had not chosen to move forward on the remarriage issue at the meeting in December, wanted me to write bill language so that he could move that issue himself during session. That now that particular request now is moot, but I did want to remind you, I have heard from legislators who are contemplating pension legislation, have asked me, would I be able to write that for them? And I've told them, yes, that is part of my job description and it's part of your expectations, but I thought I would take this opportunity to remind you before session starts that's out there. That concludes everything.
Kevin?
Thank you. Along the issue of bill writing, I think you should, because Steve, you're a wealth of knowledge, and I think you do a great job of bill writing, but also instead of only waiting to be contacted by legislators that want information in order to write a bill, you mentioned outreach, and maybe I think outreaching, and I would be interested in Jeff's thoughts on this, but outreaching to particular legislators and just and updating them and educating them on what Left 2 is about, I think would be valuable to the board, and Left 2 is a very, very well-run operation, and I think we should be able to brag about that a little and educate legislators on what it's about and clear up any misconceptions. So I would encourage you to do that, both during the session and during the interim, if you can.
And the caucus.
So let me kind of clarify this. I have had individual legislators and occasionally some of the organizations as well suggest, for instance, that during the interim it might be good to go out and talk to budget legislators. Usually is what's suggested, I think, because the budget committees do handle pension bills, and talk to them about Left 2, whether it's any questions they might have about some of the DBDC stuff, questions about what they may have heard regarding or been told about the board's rate policies. Is that the kind of stuff that you're talking about?
I think that would be glad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to follow up on Representative Van Duy's thoughts here. This is something we talked about a year ago last September during our study session about you actually being an outreach to different constituent groups out there and multi-states as they ask you exactly how we made it through the economic downturn here in reasonable shape. Not just specifically the funding mechanisms to talk to specific legislators out there about, but maybe even with SCPP or others out there to explain our fully funded status in some of the conversations we've even had here today, so as to frame the issue and not make it as simplistic as, well, they're overfunded, we can take a funding holiday from them. There's some things we need to anticipate in consideration of the coming budget that this would probably be really prudent to get out in front of.
Include your report, Steve?
Yeah, with respect to those suggestions, I don't recall specifically whether that's covered, but I would like to get a kind of a general board consensus on that issue. so that if, for instance, I don't want to get crossways with anyone. If I go out and meet with a legislator to talk about LEOFF 2, and then I want to make sure that the entire board is okay with that idea before I do anything like that. But I am willing to kind of engage in the roles that as you guys have discussed them. Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think that would be good.
Microphone's not on.
I move to have Executive Director Nelson establish outreach with legislative administrative bodies and others within the realm of state government here in an attempt to well explain and establish our position, our successes, and the benefits that we brought to of having fully funded status here to the legislature over the course of the next year.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded. Is there discussion? Okay, seeing and hearing none, all in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Okay, motion carries.
That concludes the administrative update. Are there any other questions? All right. The next topic is a follow-up. As you'll recall, last year at the December board meeting, the board discussed best practices regarding board governance, and one of those best practices was a evaluation. And the board did. Last year you conducted your first self-evaluation to get a feel from individual board members about how you felt the process was working and how the board itself was doing, as opposed to a discussion of expectations about how staff was doing. That was the first cut, and Tim is here today to kind of bring you version 2.0 of that self-evaluation. And with that, I will turn it over to Tim.
Thank you, Steve. Mr. Chair and the board. For the record, Tim Valencia, Deputy Director for the board. This is item number 7 in your materials, board governance and board evaluation. This board has done an excellent job of taking good governance very seriously, and that has been demonstrated by its consistent adoption and application of best practices. And as Steve mentioned, that one of the best practices that we hear about regularly when we're at educational conferences is the need for boards to conduct self-evaluations. As Steve did say, last year was the first board evaluation, a similar presentation to this I gave you in December, and then the results after you guys had completed an online survey were reported back to you in the March meeting. So this presentation will do two things. One is just go back over the kind of the 5 W's, the who, what, where, and why type features of governance. And then lastly, at the end of the presentation, we're asking for some direction. As we had talked about last year, we'd introduced some ideas that might be incorporated into the evaluation. So now we're seeking some direction on some of those features, and we'll review those on the last couple of slides. So again, the board self-evaluation, that at its basic level, that this is just an organized process to collect and examine your performance, both as an entire board and as individual board members with your fiduciary responsibility. It also provides an opportunity to reaffirm commitment to what the board's doing and identifying areas that may need improvement. The best practices, this is a best practice in board governance, as I mentioned. This has been adopted by leading public retirement boards across the country, and it's a contemporary practice in the public sector, particularly with regards to retirement boards. I don't think I've been to a conference yet where there wasn't at least one session talking about board governance and talking about these evaluations. Now, a good board evaluation is something that should be positive in that it gives the board a sense of its strengths. It should be constructive in terms of providing things that may need to be improved or opportunities for improvement with the board. And it should be educational in terms of identifying things that the board may need to still learn about. It is an opportunity to take a candid look at your performances for you to, as a body, to look at your performance from multiple perspectives and have candid conversations with each other about that. This demonstrates or helps demonstrate accountability to your responsibility as board members. That you're in control of the development of the board and the performance of the board. That's not something that can be delegated. So this is your opportunity to talk with each other seriously about that responsibility. And lastly, that it can be a process that can help build relationships among yourselves and with the organizations that you represent and the organizations themselves, and having these conversations. It can also be a means for looking or identifying greater ways of improving efficiency in terms of if there's, say, issues with, features of how board meetings are run. There may be points where we can find efficiency or at the same time effectiveness in terms of, how efficient, or just how we're conducting our business. So what areas have we covered in these? Last year, we had these 5 sections in the survey. They are based on, they're all considered indicators of good governance, and they're established, within the field. So it covers roles and responsibilities that both the board, from the board perspective and with staff, the policy-making process, planning and performance, conduct and practices, and then board relationships. The when and where. The best practice is that evaluations should be conducted annually, at least full board self-evaluation. So that's why we've come back at the same time this year. So this is our second annual evaluation. We learned last year that doing the survey online is the better mechanism, and that fits with our mandate of trying to use technology more efficiently. So we will continue, or plan to continue that practice this year, to do this as an online survey rather than some sort of a paper copy. And one of the best practices that this board has adopted has been transparency, and the values towards transparency often drive where these are conducted and when the reviews are done. So as we did with last year, we would plan to report on the results during an open public meeting. And so the who, the involvement side. There's usually 3 pieces that are involved with a board evaluation. There's an individual board member self-evaluation, which is an item you conducted last year, an overall board evaluation, and then input from the executive director. Now, last year's individual board member self-evaluation, as you recall, that was something that was it's intended to help you be reflective upon your own service and your own work. It is not something that was reported back for tabulation and broadly shared. That was something for each individual, and the executive director reviewed those particular evaluations, but they were not shared beyond the individual and the director. The overall board evaluation was each of your individual evaluation of the board as a whole, and the executive director evaluation was of the board as a whole. So barring future direction, that's at least where we're starting from. So as I said, there are some things then that we're looking for some direction from you today. From an individual assessment standpoint, so thinking of each as an individual, 3 of the areas that we brought up last year as possible things to include in future surveys and have come up in a variety of conversations, like even at our October offsite meeting. The areas of attendance, education level or required education, and demonstrated skill requirement level. There's a question of whether or not those are items that you want to actually have specifically evaluated or have an opportunity to evaluate on an individual basis, so person by person should those be evaluated, or is that something simple, those areas that the board just wants to manage through policy rather than specific evaluation? But those are three areas that have been brought up, as I mentioned, when we've seen presentations, they talk about things that should be evaluated. Those are three things that are recommended for evaluation when a board's doing their own evaluation. The fourth item on the list is the executive director evaluation. As I mentioned, last year's evaluation was the executive director evaluating the board as a group. This is asking if you want the executive director to do an individual evaluation, so an evaluation of each individual so that you have feedback from the director as an individual board member. And the last one is then of similar nature is the peer evaluation. Last year, each of you evaluated the board as a whole. But the question is, do you want to evaluate each individual member on the board? So those are items that we're looking for direction on whether or not you have interest in expanding into the direction into the survey from an individual standpoint. Now, from we'll call it the group assessment level, one of the new items that I had not heard before, but heard this year in a presentation at the International Foundation Conference, was an idea of doing evaluations with your stakeholders. In particular, they talked about tools such as like a 360 evaluation. But the point being, do you want to expand this evaluation where your stakeholders have an opportunity to evaluate you as a board? This again goes into your working relationship. So whether it's the Council of Firefighters that does an evaluation or Fraternal Order of Police that does an evaluation of the board itself. That's one alternative. Another item that we're asking for direction on is whether or not the board would be interested in doing an external governance review. Now, similar to with the actuarial side, where we brought in Millman to independently audit the actuaries' work, an external governance review would be something very similar, where a professional in that field would come in and do an independent review of your governance practices, both similar things to what we're evaluating, and in some cases conduct the evaluations, but they would looking at your governance practices and how you operate, and whether or not you're following, the principles of good governance. The State Investment Board did a similar exercise to that back in 2006, so it's not something that's necessarily unheard of at this level. But that would require finding and bringing in an external professional to do that kind of a review. The last item then is, do you want to begin doing individual board meeting evaluations? We did this after the October offsite meeting and got a lot of good feedback from that. But if we do them at every individual board meeting, it's an opportunity for you to provide input perhaps at the time that you're thinking of it. But it would take a little more time for you to go through and submit one for each meeting. So that is something that we are looking for as far as board direction goes. So as far as the next steps beyond discussion and direction from today, that the staff will finish developing and provide you with the survey online, and that'll be here probably as session begins. And then once the results are completed and tabulated, we would expect to then report back to you at the beginning, early in the next year. And I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Anybody have any questions?
One of the things that the new survey will be different from the last one. The part of your feedback last year was that the survey was too long and it asked questions that didn't really seem pertinent to this board. And so Tim's done a really good job of going back and scrubbing that survey tool, and we'll work together on finalizing this newer survey, but I would expect that it would be much shorter than the last one. Fewer questions. What we were looking for, trying to focus, is on being able to ask you guys the exact same questions year after year after year, so that we'd be able to do some then trend comparison, as opposed to asking you different questions every year. That if we'd be able to see as how different measurements anyway change over time. There are, can you pull up go back to some of the slides where we're looking for board direction? Some of these got discussed last year, and so we definitely don't mean to be challenging in any sense the decisions that were made last year. It was just bringing it back to give you guys a chance to review them and find out if your opinions on things like having, last year was very clear, you weren't interested in having me do an individual evaluation of board members, or the idea of having you evaluate each other. There was quite a bit of discussion about those topics, but as a board, that was where you ended up landing. By bringing it up today, again, we don't want to be, it's not to challenge that decision that you made a year ago. It's just to see if anything has changed in terms of your consensus around some of these issues. The first three tend to be more, this was something that was also discussed at the October offsite about policies around what makes a good board member. Do you want to adopt policies, an attendance policy, or a requirement that you attend as X number besides the AG required training sessions that you attend, that there's an expectation that you attend other pension related training sessions. That's where the education piece was at. And one alternative to developing a policy like that is just to evaluate it. And so what we wanted to find out is that this is not something that has been included in any past evaluations, and we wanted to get some direction from you about whether or not any of those should be. And obviously there's some overlap. So some of these things, like if there was an executive director evaluation, that might be part of it. It'd be, showed up at all the meetings, you got training, or, you missed a meeting, you got some training 2 years ago, but you haven't had any in the last couple of years. Do you feel like that would be helpful or not? Having those types of discussions is, I think, what we view on the evaluation, not me telling you whether I think you're doing a good job as a board member or not. That's not what we mean by evaluation. That would be way out of line with my role here. But it could be a discussion about what you feel like would be more help you be a board member. What can we do to help that? I'd like to get this kind of training. Is that something that the board could pay for? Those kind of questions is where the evaluation or that discussion would be centered around.
Well, I enjoy doing your evaluation. It's a lot of fun. These other things, I got to tell you, I'm not looking for more work to do here. I'd definitely be opposed to the peer evaluation, the 360 evaluation with stakeholders, board meeting evaluations. Things seem to be working pretty good from where I sit. And I don't see putting a lot of extra effort on staff and on people that are coming in here, volunteering their time or putting their time in here, adding additional evaluations to that process. That's what we have you for. You keep us up to speed on what's going on, and I don't have any issues with that.
And just to go along with what Jack said, I mean, we meet with you once a year, so I think if there was any concerns about any of these topics, that would be the proper place to have a conversation with the board member or with you. To go along with what Jack said as well is, you know, I think a peer evaluation would just be divisive. If you want to evaluate me, I don't have a problem with that. But having any type of a policy almost suggests that there's some enforcement action that goes along with it. So I'm not interested in that part of it.
Patrick?
Related to skill and education, things that our positions are recommended by other agencies and appointed by the governor. I don't know if requirement would be the thing, but having a discussion on recommended or beneficial training and education for a board member, especially when they start to get up to speed, you know, whether it's, you know, international foundation certification in pension policy or something of that regard, or some other class on funding mechanisms and actuarial principles. We all come from abroad. You know, we do similar stuff in being public safety, but we all have different backgrounds and education levels as far as funding and fiduciary responsibilities. And if there is some education level that everybody could be brought up to some base, I'd like to talk about that. But as far as making it a requirement, I don't know if that's appropriate or not. Surely could be recommended. I feel, you know, as far as evaluation and those kind of discussions about our performance, the meeting once a year has been appropriate to have some, you know, dialogue about that. Peer reviews, we're only seeing each other once a month at best throughout the year. It'd be a difficult one unless it would be a real high level thing, and then it would be just, I don't know if it would be productive.
Well, a number of you have mentioned the one-on-one meetings annually, and so I do appreciate the fact that at those meetings, many of you, maybe most of you, have not only talked about what your expectations are of me or of the team, but you've said, hey, what could I do? What could I do to make your job easier, Steve? Along those lines.
For the record, I've never said that.
Yeah.
Neither have I.
But those, and I appreciate that. I think many of you, I haven't been shy about reaching out to you when I've needed help on something, whether it was a particular issue, say during session. I know both Representative Vandewey, Representative Holy, you guys were very helpful for me last session. Now that we have another board bill recommended for this upcoming session, I'll be, I'm sure, reaching out to you again. those kind of things. I just wanted to tell you that I do appreciate that two-way that already exists under the current structure.
And I wanted to add there, Steve, it is certainly not limited to that. I mean, I live here in Olympia. It's easy for me to stop by the office, and as the chairperson, I take full advantage of that. But for any of you, you're not limited to one time a year of talking to Steve about his performance, your own contributions. That's one thing about the staff here is they're open to talking to any of us about any related subject matter at any given time. Always, if you're in town or your phone calls, everybody here that I've worked with and amongst the staff is more than happy to have conversations with us about any of the concerns we might have or any kind of education or matter that comes before you that you want to talk to them about. Is that the only, there's board direction was another one, right?
The next one on the group assessments. You're asking the organizations, like asking WACOPs, how do you think the Left 2 board is working with respect to you? External governance review, typically that's things like policies. So you'd have somebody come in and they'd look at your, how often do you meet? Do you have open public meetings? They'd look at all those kind of best practices for governance of a board and identify areas where you either were or were not meeting best practices and might provide some recommendations. Tim mentioned the SIB has done that. Other groups do that. That would be, they wouldn't be asking you so much. They wouldn't be doing a subjective evaluation. In other words, they wouldn't be looking at things like, oh, your funded status, you guys are doing a great job. They'd be more looking just at cut and dried. Here are best practices, and your monthly meetings, your meeting frequency is good. Your open public meetings, that's good. You representation on the board from all of the affected stakeholders, that's good. Those are all examples off the top of my head of best practices that you guys are clearly meeting. And the board meeting evaluations, that we have a number of different presenters who have different styles. We're always trying to meet. We've got board members who prefer detailed discussions and board members who prefer less discussion and getting over with the meetings as quick as possible. That's always changing as your makeup of the boards change, and even I think to some extent some of the board members who've been on the board 10 years might have had one level of interest in having a big discussion the first time you heard a particular issue. If you've heard that same issue now 5 times.
He's talking about the administrative update.
Yeah, or 40 times on administrative updates. It's different. But we do want, if there are if you felt like this would be a tool that would be helpful when we meet with you once a year, that's never been something that any of you have talked about in detail about, at that particular meeting, that presentation really could have been done better. And maybe it's because it's just not fresh. If you had that chance to provide input at each meeting, then those topics would be right in front of you when we do that we've done that at the last 2 October meetings, and there's been feedback, not all positive, but all helpful in terms of what could or couldn't have been done better at that particular meeting. It gives us a chance to incorporate some of those suggestions into future meetings. However, back to your point, Jack, you guys are all volunteers, and it is an additional workload both for you and for us. And so if your direction is that you're kind of comfortable with doing what we did last year, except a much shorter survey and more focused survey, and not adding anything to that this year, then that's what we'll do.
On this slide, Steve, I see, external governance review, I think would be helpful. I don't know how often you'd need that, but I've been around boards that, you think everything is going well and you think you're doing everything appropriately, but you're not. It's only the same people looking at each other and thinking everything's going well. It'd be nice to have an outside review just to kind of remind you if your performance is consistent with your policies or how you said you're going to govern yourself. The other things, the 360 evaluation with stakeholders, I think the more outreach you have now, and we've had with the state council for a long time, but these other groups, I think you're going to get a lot of feedback right there at their events, whether that's, not just the participant groups, but the others, the fire commissioners, the fire chiefs, the cities and counties. So the only one of these I think that would be helpful maybe is to have some kind of formalize a little bit of external governance review just to make sure that we are as good as we think we are.
To go along with that, that external review, you could actually incorporate some of those other elements that we were talking about before, as far as attendance and education and all those could be a consideration for this external body to look at.
Right, I don't know to what extent some of those are
just an option.
Are best practices. They might be the kind of things that they would identify. For instance, they might say, you don't have an attendance policy. I don't know whether that's a best practice or not, but it does lead to the right where you said is anytime you've got a policy, then it's what are the ramifications, and that's
right.
what we talked about in October. We don't have anything like that. What would be the enforcement? I mean, it's a volunteer board,
right?
So the idea of how do you
no disciplinary process.
Right.
I don't think we want one.
Yeah.
I don't. But anyway, to go along with the stakeholder evaluations, unpredictable. I don't think we want to be doling those out and looking at what actually comes back. The stakeholder group that I'm affiliated with, they receive a lot of misinformation, and they're very selective in what they choose to commit to memory. So it can be dangerous. So I would discourage that practice.
Well, I know, like for instance, if you individual members, I'm not talking about stakeholder groups now, but individual members, a lot of times they have a very, their idea of evaluating the board, one of the things I hear if I go out all the time is, when that initiative passed, I expected a 3% multiplier. You haven't got me that, so as far as I'm concerned, you guys have done a lousy job. And they don't care about funding, and they don't understand the benefits. How about the fact that your 2% multiplier that you do have is lock solid, as opposed to benefits being cut in other plans. So I know exactly what you're talking about, and the perspective of different groups about what is and isn't good performance. If you were going to go down that road, you'd probably have to have more like some specific survey type questions. Do you feel like you know what the board is up to? Do you feel like if you have questions about board actions, you've got some place to go? Those types of questions. Satisfaction about benefit improvements, that's they're never completely satisfied.
Right.
All right, I think that has been very helpful discussion. If if there's not any further input, then the final item on the agenda is the agenda items for future meetings, and this will be very brief. Right now, there's a calendar in your materials of all the future meetings scheduled. As I mentioned earlier, the plan for the January meeting is that it will be electronic. We don't expect there to be a quorum. There's not going to be any action items on the agenda. There will be a legislative update, which for January might be brief. I don't know how many pension bills are going to get introduced early on in session, but at least now there is one left board bill that I'll be reporting on, being so that you can track that. And also, to the extent that there's anything relevant or you have questions about the administrative stuff, we'll do a brief administrative update. For instance, things like keeping you up to date on the agency budget, for instance. Now, if the new format for these electronic meetings seems to be going well in January and February, and you want to expand that to include more options, especially if session gets to be extensive and you're concerned. I know there were concerns 2 years ago, for instance, about going 6 months between board meetings. Many board members felt like they had kind of lost touch with everybody and what the board was working on. We might be able to accomplish more of that, keeping you up to speed and letting you dialogue with each other in some of those later electronic meetings during session.
I had one last thing I wanted to bring up here, and that is a year ago we had a presentation here from NC PERS, Gallagher Benefit Services, Bill Robinson, about group voluntary term life insurance. And I serve on the NC PERS board and have for over 10 years now. And so I wanted to ask if I could obtain board approval to offer this plan. As I recall, we had the presentation and then took no action. And there was some conversation on the board about offering the plan, and I think at some point no motion was made. So I would like to offer that motion to have the board approve to offer the decreasing term life insurance plan voluntarily for left Plan 2 members. Okay, moved and seconded. Is any discussion? I would like to just kind of mention here that there are the PowerPoint is you could go find it through our website just to make sure that you can recall what we talked about in the presentation, and it was essentially that we would approve the plan, and then Gallagher Benefit Services would provide all of the groundwork, and all we would do is facilitate that. They'd do all the work, and it was no cost to the board. And we simply needed to determine if it was going to be self-pay or payroll deduction, which in this point we don't have any authorization to do anything but self-pay. And so that's the payment method. So we just provide help with open enrollment notifications, and that's all that the board would have to do. So, and again, letting everybody know here that we would not be alone in this. The Arkansas, Connecticut, Idaho, Illinois, Louisiana, Minnesota, Wyoming, and then other local governments are all already enrolled in the plan, and there are, I think, over. Can't remember. They paid out $13 million last in 2013. So the plan is viable, and it's providing services to a number of public safety employees and public employees throughout the country. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, I think there's a open enrollment process using online tools as well.
I think the last time when they were talking about that, they were coordinate that with one of our newsletters The next newsletter, oh, I should mention that, the next newsletter is in final development stages, and that'll be going out here during session. So this would be for the newsletter after that. Any expenses, they said they would reimburse us for.
Correct. Okay. Further questions? Seeing none, all in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Okay, motion carries. Any other business to come before the board? Okay, as Steve indicated, our next meeting is teleconferenced in. Some of us will be able to be here, but others, if we don't see you, we'll hear from you at the January meeting. All right, thank you, and we are adjourned.
Less than an hour.
It took an hour and 10 if you include the 15 minutes for lunch.
Did the SCPP bring up that bill that I about the public employers having to offer state DCP?
They did not, they didn't take it out. The only bill that they approved two bills for this session. One is technical correction. Help on that last year.
I don't want to do it for everybody else because they haven't made any determination about that cost issue.
On the annuity?
Yes.
Nobody else had really asked for it. The troopers wanted it. Left one showed up yesterday and asked, say, hey, as long as you're doing it for the troopers and you already did it for left two, can you include us in? And then there was some discussion about.
How would you?
There's only 100 of you. There's not less than 100, but he wanted it for retirees.
Yeah,
And
of course he does.
They said there's no way we could. That's a much bigger issue. So they blew that off. But,
Well, also Warbrook keeps writing letters about Social Security and the government pension offset. Of course, he would never have to pay for it. He'd just get it.
All right, happy holidays, guys.
all right, see ya.
See you, Kevin. Thank you, Steve.
It's a good meet. Good December meeting. I got it.
Happy New Year, fellas.
Oh, thank you.
Absolutely.
Hi, brother. Yep.